But we will go ahead and get started this morning. And for the record, I'm Fred Heldenfels, Chairman of the Council for Continuous Improvement and Innovation in Texas Higher Education. And it's always a pleasure to welcome each of you to this council and appreciate the work that you've put into it. Thank you, Judy. This is, believe it or not, this is our 6th meeting. We are striving to establish the next long-range plan for higher education in the state of Texas beyond closing the gaps. And in preparation, we want to begin really building a final consensus on the measurable long-range goals and objectives that we as a council are recommending for assessing our progress beyond closing the gaps targeted at 2030. So in your packet today, the hard copy materials are on the left side. You've got the agenda for today, the biographies for our presenters today, minutes from the last meeting on October 24th, the contact information and affiliations for each of the members of our council, and then on the right side are the presentations and handouts in order of today's agenda. The printed PowerPoint regarding beyond closing the gaps does not include the sources for the data slides, so you may want to note the sources for the data that are included on the first 3 slides when that's presented. There's an article of interest from the Wall Street Journal, an executive summary of our recent survey from the Association of Governing Boards. It's a very interesting comparison between what board regents and trustees across the country think about higher education in general versus their perception of their own institution. And as you might imagine, human nature being what it is, there's a disconnect. And then there's also the list of the 3 discussion groups that will break out this afternoon. We're going to be focusing in today on trying to build consensus around the 4 major goals, which, as you'll recall, we've developed what we call the WAVE model. That's workforce, or improving the percentage of graduates employed or enrolled in relevant fields in 6 months. Alignment throughout the P16 pipeline, measured by increasing the proportion of 8th grade students who complete a certificate or degree within 11 years. Value, which we've initially described as increasing the percentage of degrees and certificates earned within 100% time. And excellence, ensuring that 100% of students demonstrate competence in their field. With these possible major goals in mind, and to provide some background information for council members' consideration this morning, that we will hear from council members Gerry Griffin, Brenda Hellyer, and Charles Matthews, as well as myself, regarding the council's work to date that was presented at the coordinating board meeting on October 25th. We'll also hear from Susan Brown, Assistant Commissioner for Planning and Accountability, and Lee Holcomb, the Director of our Policy Institute, about the strengths and weaknesses of each of these major goals and some measurable targets that are associated with each of these possible major goals. After the presentations and discussions this morning, our council will have lunch. That's good news. We're not going to pass up on that. And then we'll divide into the 3 groups I alluded to earlier. Each group will meet for about an hour to further discuss and reach consensus among your own groups on the recommendations pertaining to the major goals. And then we'll briefly discuss the recommendations as a full council. So today, I'm asking each group, when we break into those groups, to address the following 2 questions. Specifically, which of the WAVE measures does your group believe are of primary importance? And then what process should be used for further defining and refining the supporting objectives under what I'm calling the 4+1. That is, the one overriding goal of 60% of working age Texans holding some post-secondary attainment, and the 4 major supporting goals under the WAVE model. I mentioned Witt's decision to resign, so we'll, before our next meeting, be recruiting someone to replace him. And he has also agreed to, he's agreed to co-chair a capital campaign as well as the other board initiative that I referred to. So he's going to be busy. All right, I think we're going to get started now. So Melinda is going to provide a brief summary of our October 24th meeting, and then we'll turn it over to the 3 board members who presented to the coordinating board.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. So again, our October meeting, the theme was cost efficiency, and there was unanimous agreement to add metrics for both cost efficiencies and productivity among all of the three groups. The range, and not just the average out-of-pocket student cost per degree, was the focus of what should be examined, meaning both and not just one or the other. And having the goal to ensure that cost savings are fairly and appropriately shared between the state and the students. Focus on the statewide total cost for both associate and bachelor degrees awarded, and disaggregate by category and institutions of higher education. The composite measure of transfer alignment between high school and college and between 2-year and 4-year institutions was met with overwhelming support, again, among all three groups. And the number of citations, number of patents, and licensing income that was discussed was really seen as a secondary consideration among all of the three groups, especially the number of citations, looking at those three items. It was cited as not a relevant focus, again, secondary, not primary. And more so, the focus should be on the value of, what the value, rather, would be to the statewide economy in the growth of total alternative funding. And that's actually the summary that was presented at the board meeting that I believe, was it? Yes, did you have a question? Oh, Charles Matthews, sorry. He was letting me know that it was him, of the three that went ahead and presented for your group. Are there any concerns or questions, suggestions? All right, thank you.
All right, thanks, Melinda. Next item on the agenda is to briefly summarize the presentation on the summation of our work last year that was given to the coordinating board October 25th. You've got a handout in your materials that looks like this. It's the same presentation that was used at that time, and we discussed the themes and as well as the people that we heard from, just to give an overview to the board. If you'll recall, a year ago in January of 2012, the focus was on international competitiveness in higher education, and we heard from Councilmember Woody Hunt and also Ames McGinnis with NCHEMS. In April, the focus turned to student success, and we heard from Andreas Schleicher with the OECD, and Larry Faulkner and George Granger with the Houston Endowment. The July focus turned to workforce. We heard testimony from both Dr. Anthony Carnevale with Georgetown University and Doug Ridge. And then finally in October, as Melinda just summarized, we turned our focus to cost efficiency and heard from, among others, Cal Callison. The January meeting was where we kind of zeroed in on the criteria for determining who our comparison peers should be. And we talked in terms of both leading states and leading countries. We had a lot of discussion about whether 60% was a reasonable benchmark for 2030, or whether we should shoot for different levels or timing, and then how do we incorporate skill competency levels into that discussion. Interestingly, I brought a recent article from the Chronicle of Education that talks about what they're doing in Indiana and their Commissioner of Higher Education's recent address to, I believe, their state legislature or a state conference. Indiana is also targeting 60% of the state's adult population by 2025 rather than 2030. And I'm looking for what their benchmark is, but they're down around in that 30% range that Texas finds itself in, if I recall correctly. So just kind of interesting to see that other states are having the same discussion that we are, and are actually picking 5 years sooner to try to hit that target. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Gerry and Brenda and Charles to talk about the portions that they summarized for the coordinating board back in October.
You want to, as a suggestion, Brenda, you want to use Gerry, you want to use the timeline that she gave us of the video, of the YouTube video, because it's got on there where the questions are, and everybody's already heard the rest of this, but what they might be interested most is what the board members had to say to us in response to what we had to say. If you, on that page 3 of 3, it starts there with Gerry. I think he pops up there first, and David started asking us some questions, and those responses, I'll jump in whenever you want.
What I heard from the questions that we got from the coordinating board members, first of all, I heard a lot of people excited about the work excited about the work that was being done. And I actually covered the April meeting and talked about that 60% by 2030 and the countries that we had looked at, as competitive countries or countries that we could learn from, and also some states that we had discussed. As the questions came later in the conversation about the 60%, there were questions about, yes, it's a reasonable benchmark that we need to go after. It's a difficult benchmark. It's a stretch. But then there was also conversations from one of the board members about how we could possibly break that 60% out, disaggregate it somewhat, maybe by the different age groups.
That was David. Gerry, you want to jump in?
Yeah. In the July meeting, we had Dr. Carnevale and Doug Ridge. And by the way, I thought both of those presentations were really outstanding, kind of eye-opening. Carnevale is a Georgetown guy that has done a lot of work in this arena, and he says tying transcripts to the outcome is, and where they wound up is, where students wind up is the gold standard. And I guess we've done some of that, and we're getting better at it. Doug Ridge talked about the needs of the Texas workforce and what's going on. By the way, I've had some further conversations with him on specific areas. In fact, it has to do with space. And he gave us, I think Doug Ridge at the Workforce Commission is a guy that he comes from industry, and so he has a different view of the world. He hasn't been a government guy all of his life. He's been on the other side. And I thought his data was extremely helpful in looking at the future. I thought about both of those things and a reflection that I had on it. And it's something that I think Charles said, and maybe Brenda said during our presentation, is that somehow, when we look forward now to establish metrics, I think we've got to measure student intent somehow. We've got so many people in the state now, and Charles and Brenda both commented on it, that aren't going to college or post-secondary education of any kind to get a certificate or a degree. They want to go do something. They want to find something. They want to learn how to weld or learn how to be how you plumb something, but they're not interested particularly in getting a certificate for it or a degree. And yet we have to count those in our graduation rates and our success rates and that sort of thing. So somehow to me it seems like early on you need to find a student's intent. Why are you doing this to get a degree? Or are you doing it to get a certificate or whatever? I think those kids or people, adults in many cases, we may need to take them out of the count. If that we're not making them go to school. We don't have truancy or anything from post-secondary education. So somehow we've got to determine if their intent is to go all the way, and if it is, then they need to be counted on how long it takes. The other thing that Charles mentioned, which really hit my thought button later, is that we've got people starting college now that are married, maybe have a couple of kids, both of them work, They know going in it's going to take them 6 to 10 years to finish, and yet we count them all the same. We count them as everybody's starting together, and so 4-year graduation rates count, 6-year graduation rate count. And we've got people now that are in our workforce or going to be in our workforce that are approaching education from a different angle than just coming out of high school and going into college. And so out of that workforce requirement and looking at tying transcripts to how the student actually winds up, does he end up using the degree that he came after? Those two things really hung with me. And I think as we go forward to 2030, we need to be a little more sophisticated in establishing our metrics. That's kind of what I drew out of it.
I think that's right. David, the board member who asked the question, is from Beaumont. And so a lot of his questions he was talking about things that I was familiar with because I knew he was talking about LIT and Lamar. I thought he made a couple of points that I thought were good. Let me give you just a minute background. That whole southeast Texas region is full of petrochemical plants and refineries. And their relationship with the colleges there, the 4 Lamar colleges, is really tight. And they basically say to the school, we need these kinds of folks, and they go recruit them and they train them exactly for the job. So David talked about stackable, really certificates. He talked about somebody who got 18 hours and that helped them get another promotion in their job. I'm sure he was talking about a refinery when he was doing that. He's talking about no degree, and really he didn't even mention that it was a certificate, just that they needed 18 hours. That somebody told them, their boss told them what they needed to take, and they went and took it, and they were able to do the job. At LIT, they've got a mini refinery there, so they can teach those guys to read gauges and go through the whole process. But I thought the best thing that David said, he got to talking about the closing the gap and that we have broken that down by race. And he said, as I began thinking about what you guys are doing and thinking about the 60% deal, I think that maybe you need to break it down by age categories. You'll have a better chance in saying, okay, maybe the kids 18 to 22 are doing just fine, but our numbers are short. But what about all these folks that are over 40 who the coordinating board has identified? You got about 3 million folks in the state, I think, that have got some college. What are we doing in those areas to try to bring those people up to date? So he was making the point that he thought that we'd be better off, rather than using race, to break it down by age categories and then measure how we were doing in those various sectors, which I thought was a really, really good idea. I had not thought of it quite like that. Dennis Golan, who is from Carthage, he served on the board of Pinole College, junior college there for a long time. I'd met him years ago when I was a railroad commissioner. And so he really gets the junior college thing. He understands the role that they've got, and he was talking about there again in his area, and he was talking about oil and gas, talking about the demands that they have there in East Texas in the field, and working with Pinole College and how they're designing programs for what the industry wants them to do. And that relationship, talked about how important that was, and I think we're all up to date on that. David then jumped in again with a statement about we need to get on these kids who are not graduating, and it's taking them longer than 4 years. And that's what prompted my remark back to him. I said, well, there's been some research done on that people who have a good source of income, their parents make good money, or they're on a full ride scholarship, they do real well in 4 years. But it's those kids who are married and maybe a little older and have got children and can only go to school a maximum of 6 hours a week. Those kids, you need to judge those differently. And then I began talking about, and I think the board gets it, that none of this is possible. The 60% number is not possible unless we figure out a way to increase the Texas grants money or scholarships of some sort, because the population we're looking at to educate are mostly poor people, regardless of race. And so we're going to have to we're going to figure out a way to step that up. And we're going to talk about it, I think, Fred, somewhere in this, in this report, and in a way that is in big bold letters where the legislature catches it. I mean, we're going to have to do a whole lot better on Texas grants than we're doing now if we intend to make this goal.
Ironically, I may have to leave this meeting a little bit early to join the commissioner to testify about just that to Senate Finance this afternoon around 1:30.
I know they'll be sympathetic.
Well, I trust they will. They will at least understand that it's our top dollar funding priority.
It's impossible. I go at it from the standpoint of, if you've heard any of the state demographers' talks or any of those, read any of the stuff, when you see those numbers, I mean, it's just right there in front of you. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, excuse me, to understand right away that we're going to have some more money.
Melinda, if we go to the wave diagram, I think that was the next one. We each took some time talking about the workforce alignment, the value, and the excellence. And I think that really helped generate some additional questions. On the alignment piece, we did get a lot more conversations around the stackable pieces. How do we really look at that? And alignment with our public school. There was a lot of conversations around that this needed to become a P through 16, and that you had to make sure that these weren't two separate systems, that you were getting those students college ready at an earlier age. And David did stress the importance again of that stackable, but again doing it earlier, that high school students are graduating with 30 to 60 credit hours in college.
Full enrollment, yeah.
How do you work through that piece of it? And what was interesting, during the alignment piece, I threw out the 150% to time to degree. And David's question back to me was, well, 150% to degree is inadequate. We should be 100% or less. And so that time to degree, how do you really build that in? But the conversations, and then again on the 60%, another piece that came out was regarding how should that be broken down regarding STEM? And have we looked at those different allocations? And then again, how that 60% should be broken down between bachelor's degrees, associate degrees, and certificates. And Fred, I think you gave the numbers of where we need it to be in those categories, and that largely bachelor's and certificates were the areas where some of that future growth is being seen.
That was where the 2020 projected job requirements showed that the shortfall would be with bachelor's and certificates, and there would actually be this is a national figure, a surplus of associate degree earners. So you kind of, part of that, you talked about measuring student intent. I think there's two things that I take away from that. One is we also have to set our goals in context of what does our workforce need. Amen. And I think Texas, in a way, does a little better job than most states, maybe all other states, in measuring intent, because we're counting not just associates and bachelors, but those certificates as successes as well, and they line up with a lot of the job demand. And the other thing I had asked David, I think you and I had this conversation, but we were going to get that breakdown from Dr. Carnevale, because we asked that question when he spoke to us in July about, okay, you're saying 65% of all jobs in 2020 will require post-secondary attainment of some level, but break that down for us. And he was kind of doing it, shooting from the hip. Did we get those specific breakdowns from him?
Lee's going to.
Okay, good.
Probably varies a little bit state to state, I would think. But nationally, there's probably an average or something. Did he actually look at Texas?
He did. Okay. And his projection for Texas, and here's the question for us, is do we want this to be our projection? Is that rather than 65%, which is the national projection, Texas would be 59% of jobs requiring post-secondary training in the same year, 2020. And I think it was Woody, when that point came out at an earlier meeting last year, Woody asked the question, is that, actually this was at a Texas Business Leadership Council conference in Dallas, do we want that to be Texas projection, 59%, or do we want to look like the more highly educated, vertically integrated economies in other states, like be it Massachusetts or wherever? So I think that's something else we need to take into context. Is the 59% because we have a lot of lower wage and non-high school or only high school graduate workers? And do we want it to move more towards the 65%?
Right.
David?
And I just wanted to add, as with closing the gaps, when that was developed, the board realized that some of these measures or goals would need to be changed as the environment changed. And particularly when you're talking about the workforce, whatever you decide to set, you need to, I think, encourage that the board continue to look at that as you go forward to make sure that number is right, that perhaps it needs to be increased at some point, or if you're talking about certain conditions in the workforce, they may change. So you want to always reflect what's going to take you forward rather than to say, well, we said exactly this in this year and we're going to stay with that even though it doesn't make sense anymore.
Right. Right.
I have the impression, I may be wrong, somebody's more current than I, but I have the impression that employers are now speaking up and saying to good employees, I need you to go back to, junior college or wherever. I need you to go take these courses. And if you'll do that, we'll talk about a raise. We'll talk about an increase in responsibility. But I think the initiative and the drive is coming more from the employer, or as much from the employer as the student. But I don't have any empirical data for that. Somebody else may know. Dave, you may know. But I'm hearing more and more stories like that coming out of my friends in industry, that they're telling their employees, look, everybody's trying to make a buck as best they can. And they're not spending as much time on training. A lot of companies not spending as much time on training as they did in the past because they see this opportunity to partner with the colleges, particularly the two-year schools, and to let them do that and to say, well, part of my property tax is paying for that, and so working whatever kind of relationship they need to with the college. And so I see a lot of drivers coming in, and I think that'll get to the point that Raymond made, that are we trying to educate the workforce we have today or the workforce we'd like to have? I think the workforce that we'd like to have will say to their employees, we need to step it up as a company, and I need you to have this particular set of skills, and here's a way for you to go get them, and we'll help you in some sort of way. But I think you're going to have a lot of push from employers there because the world is getting more and more competitive.
Well, in fact, I think most community colleges, or at least a lot of them I'm familiar with, they're also being kind of entrepreneurial. Brenda, you may be able to speak to this, but they have someone on staff who's a director of workforce training who really reaches out to employers to make sure they understand the employer's needs.
That's exactly right. We design the programs that they need. We're actually looking at offering a midnight to 3 a.m. course so that we can take non-destructive testing, people that are working plant hours that can come and do that course. And we're designing it specifically for them. We've been working with the crafts areas to design crafts trade programs that they need. And we're revising our curriculum pretty much on an annual basis based on what industry is telling us from our advisory committees. But and I just hired an admiral to design the maritime program exactly to what the maritime needs are. So it's, again, bringing in the experts. You can't do that if you don't have people who understand what's really going on.
So in this workforce goal area, I think that the community colleges are really kind of in the lead, more aligned with employer needs than our four-year universities in some respects. And so the universities could probably take a page from what the community colleges are doing by being, kind of nimble in
I'd say that is correct unless you talk about the STEM fields. They're the engineering folks, they're in geology, all of those kinds of degrees. There is a relationship between industry and those four-year colleges because they've got to have those people.
Oh, yeah.
And they're really focused in there. But in some of the other part, probably 80% of the college programs are not.
Brad, you might be a good example. Your company, as I understand it, goes all the way from engineers that are highly skilled and advanced degrees and so forth, all the way down to workers that are probably certificated or even uncertificated. Have you seen a change in the mix requirements that you really need to function in this environment? Or is it changing?
Well, what's changing in my industry, and this speaks to the economy, is using both lean means and methods and technology to try to reduce the labor content, the reliance on labor, be it skilled or unskilled. In our industry, we still do a lot of OTJ, on the job training. We have worked with community colleges in the past. It goes back to what you said, Charles, about state funding. There was a program at one time called Smart Funds or something like that we worked with Austin Community College up here and Del Mar Community College in Corpus Christi to do some training of our crew supervisors. And so, a lot of times it's funding driven, but I think the need now, the second most critical worry that I hear in my industry and related industries, and Raymond, you probably hear this too, but is once we get out of this recession and there's actually demand for construction again, where's the skilled workforce going to come from? Because an employment or a workforce of 7.7 million workers during the peak years before the recession is now only 5.5 million workers. And those 2.2 million, most of them have just left the industry and gone on to other things. So there is a shift. Unfortunately, I think part of the shift is focused back on vocational training in high school. And a lot of employers are advocating for that. And so that during this session, there's going to be a lot of discussion about do we go back to creating a different track for students who are interested in career tech, or do we create greater flexibility in the 4x4 curriculum so that those students can stick to the rigor that we've tried to build into public education, but take more applied science and math courses that would prepare them for that career tech. So that's going to be at the heart of the debate on public education.
And you're already thinking about the future when the construction industry does come back.
Yeah.
And that's the point that I think David made so well, is that we got to be nimble. We don't know exactly what the world's going to look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now, much less 2030. So we got to be able to adapt and maybe change these goals as we go forward.
Gerry or Brenda and Charles, did you all have any other comments?
There's one other comment. I don't want to forget what what Bobby Jenkins said. We went to talking about a little bit about the economic impact that colleges had in these communities, and we need to figure out a way to try to make that part of this report. I mean, there's so much value that's given by the colleges in the communities where they exist, and I think we need to highlight that maybe a little bit more than we have in the past. I mean, these many towns in Texas would not be as economically viable as they are today without their colleges there and the role that they play. And I think maybe that may be a way to help us build more political support for what we're all trying to do here, is to talk a little bit more about that. You know, the governor at one time on the Business Council, Jody, you probably were there when they were doing that. You were trying to break the state down by sections, and I didn't think that worked very well, but by communities, it certainly will work. If you're talking about a legislator's hometown or where he's from, and you're talking about what's going on there and the economic impact that college has, those numbers are readily available now. Bobby talked a little bit about that, and I thought it was a good point.
Yeah, Bobby is a former chairman of the Austin Chamber of Commerce, so
you can tell it when he talks.
He's pretty well steeped in economic development issues. Ray, you had a question or comment?
Yes, I was going to just mention what you talked about, the split, going a trade route versus higher education route. I've come to the conclusion that really needs to take place in high school. maybe at the beginning of high school. I wonder if we've done a study to find out kids that drop out at 16 or 17, why they drop out. They drop out because they're bored. They drop out because they really want to do something hands-on with their hands, like being a construction worker. And they just don't have the skill set, the DNA, so to speak, to take on the STEM kind of classes. And if we got them earlier into a trade, I wonder if we'd solve some of the crime issues that we have as well. As opposed to these kids dropping out because they don't want to take that algebra class. And I think there was a study recently about too much focus on college algebra at the university and community college level as a core course, when you may not even need that in your career. Maybe basic arithmetic is adequate. And as a result, I wonder how much money we're spending in higher education, whether it's community college or four-year institutions, with trying to bring kids up to a standard that they really don't want or don't need for what might be their career.
I think you make some good points there, but the other thing that the commissioner and I have, when this topic has come up, because frankly, better results in public education would be one of the most cost-effective things we could do for higher education. Right. And is that you also have to look at today's student as being on more of an elevator ride, and by that I mean they may initially just want to get off on the second floor and have a career, in construction, or whether it's as a certified welder, what have you, a process tech. But then they may want to get back on that elevator and go up another level when 5 years later they want to open their own welding shop and they want to get an associate's degree in business or something like that. So their preparation, even if they want a career tech track, they still need the sufficient preparation to be able to go back and add to their learning and their education later on in greater numbers than before. So that's the trick, that's the balance, and we'll bring it back to these metrics. But how do we, as both commissioners, Raymond Paredes for higher education and Michael Williams for public education, have said, they want to retain the rigor and the accountability, but add greater flexibility. And Tom Pauken and the folks that he has gathered to support his approach are talking about what you started talking about, and that is creating a completely different track, beginning in ninth grade or where have you. And I think the concern of having a whole different track is you're going to have different levels of accountability, different testing. So that's why I say I think what we're talking about right now will be at the heart of the public education debate. It's not just about the STAR exams. It's really, how do we meet workforce needs most effectively, as well as the students' needs, for future levels of education.
Fred, if I may add, I'm sorry. If I may add to this train of thought, we're leaving for Orlando on Saturday because we're up for a national award based on a program like what you're talking about, Ray, which is we take juniors and seniors in high school and put them in academies. And they're all focused on, there's four of them. There's one on nursing, IT, manufacturing, and aerospace. And these high school kids who really don't want to go through that steep academic track that we put them on have become very, very, become the pipeline for those industries that are identified in those academies. The students are doing so well that, for example, our Cyber Patriot team that went into the national competition won the national championship. And these are kids that are 17 and 18-year-olds. They were trained in cyber security. And now those kids have graduated from high school. They have the high school diploma. They have 30 hours of community college credit or college credit. They have a job. And we find that those students that are going through those academies, 50% of them continue toward their associate's degree. And we're also finding that the industry is invested in them. For example, we're taking a young lady who went from Edison High School, which is one of our poorest high schools in San Antonio. She went in as a line mechanic at, I think it was Boeing or Lockheed, and proceeded to go from there and then worked for a couple of years, got her associate's degree. The company paid for that. Then they turned around and paid for her a bachelor's, and she's now a contract supervisor for that company and is making a six-figure salary, and the company's paying for her master's degree, which is enrolled now. And we have a model that shows just that. The kids want to do something right away. They don't want to get into this, you know, I mean, when I grew up, liberal arts was wonderful, and we all wanted to be proficient in literature and so on and so forth. The kids nowadays want to do something. The 6 students that were in the Cyber Patriot team came from varied high schools throughout San Antonio. It was kind of like a magnet situation because of the academies. And they basically told us, we just wanted to do something, and we were interested in one thing and one thing only. And so, again, the more contextual you get, which is workforce-oriented, the more success you're going to have. Now, there's a drive in not only San Antonio, but throughout the state and nationally to get more workforce tracked in terms of if your degree is going to mean something, it needs to lead to a job. One of our private schools is going through a real hassle right now, Tessa Pollock at OLLU, Our Lady of the Lake, because she's pretty much cut out a bunch of degrees that don't lead anywhere. And she's trying to get that university to move toward the workforce emphasis that we're talking about here. So I think it's something that really merits a lot of discussion, and I think I'm excited that we're having this discussion here, because I think community colleges are already there. We're ready to we can adapt to anything. One of the major pushes for us right now is the Eagle Ford Shale, and we're leading that consortium of community colleges in South Texas to address ourselves to that need. And like you said, Gerry, we're nimble, we're flexible, and we're there. But again, I think industry starting to, at least in the South Texas area in San Antonio, starting to understand that we play a vital role, and we're a vital component in whatever vibrancy is going to happen in their industry.
I want to point out one last thing on the presentation, but to what both of y'all are saying, I think the key thing that I keep hearing is the need to engage the student's interest early. And I'm reminded of one other comment from a friend of mine, Bob Parker, who owns a large industrial contracting company based in Corpus, but they do work all over. And he said, you know, Corpus has a career tech training high school that I plan to visit. They've got a program that industry has supported there. And he pointed out that when he takes a student and they take an applied math course that pertains to job site field work, let's say, that his observation is that student then goes back and has not only a greater interest, but performs better in college algebra or what have you, or algebra 1 or 2 that you take in high school. And I think that's a great point. You know, if you engage the student's interest early on and show them, start with the application and then let them go back, and once they appreciate the use of it, many of them perform much better.
And we're having the same effect. I mean, a lot of it has to do with confidence too. A lot of these kids are not confident in terms of whether they've got what it takes to be a college student, for example. And so when they go through these programs, and they are, I mean, all our programs are, you have to be college ready. These juniors and seniors, for example, have to be college ready. They are certified. They have to take the test, and they do it in their junior year before they even complete their senior year. So getting the confidence that they can do college level work gives them the confidence to continue and finally move on into something. Whereas before, they would get through a senior year and they didn't have any confidence. They'd go into the workforce and get a menial job or whatever is out there. And this way, they get that confidence, they get that ability to understand what society wants from them, and they do well. They do exceedingly well. And so we're very excited about the program, but I think it's a model that we all need to look at in terms of, we assume that people want to go to college, and I don't think that's a very bad assumption.
To me, this whole process is a pipeline, and I think too often we start at the college level and we worry about the college problems from the 18-year-old on up. And it's really a continuum from the kindergarten or even preschool all the way through the process. Now, I don't know if the legislature looks at it as a continuum, or if there's a higher education group and there's a K through 12 group and they don't communicate. I have no idea. But to me, the earlier you can get those kids, like you're talking about, as a sophomore in high school. Think about a sophomore. They're 14, 15-year-old. You know, when I grew up, well, I grew up on a cattle ranch. When you were 14, 15 years old, you could almost run the place. I mean, you couldn't run the financials part of it, but you knew how to work cattle because you were taught that from the time you were 10 years old. And so I think we're starting too late if we're thinking about it from only at a higher education level, considering community college and four-year. I think you got to start talking about those freshmen and sophomore. And I don't know how that works politically and fundraising and funding and all that, but
that's one reason.
I think we could catch these kids earlier, and you could get them on a trade track. And like you said, if he's doing basic trigonometry on a house because that's how he builds up the rafters, he'll have more interest in learning algebra.
Mm-hmm.
And see, I agree with you in the sense that if it's contextualized, for example, if you're in our aerospace academy, every bit of math that you're dealing with deals with supporting that industry. And the kids really are attracted to that. And that contextualization helps them develop an interest that you can't be matched. If you take those students that are dealing with actual application versus those that are just doing Algebra 1 just because they've got to have it on their transcript when they go to college, there's a varied approach in terms of how the kids approach that particular course. And they get something that they can hang on to and use later on in life. So again, I agree with you 100%. Our model that we were using in San Antonio is showing us that the more you contextualize the students' experience, the more success you're going to have. And this is especially important for us in community colleges in San Antonio because we deal with a lot of with the Hispanic population, especially the boys or the males and the blacks. And the more you contextualize it for that population, the more they're going to succeed. And we're not, one of the political things that we struggled with early on was, are we tracking minorities, for example? And we're finding that it has the opposite effect. It keeps them in school. It keeps them moving forward. We have a young man that came out of those academies and now is a troubleshooter for Boeing in Seattle. He goes all over the country solving problems for them. He's only 28 years old. And I can guarantee you that young man would not have done that had he not had that experience and we not intervened early on like we had.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Let me point out one last thing about the presentation because it'll be a good segue into the next item on the agenda. Ironically, when we started this meeting, I was worried about running too far ahead on our agenda, but I should have known better. This group would not allow that to happen. The last thing I wanted to point out is that we used a different, the wave diagram or exhibit that's on the screen and that you have in the PowerPoint presentation is, you'll notice, different and less detailed than the one that has the big red capital draft at the top left corner of it. We use this more detailed one, the Commissioner and I, at an interim House higher education hearing. And sure enough, what we learned is the members of that committee started drilling down into the nitty-gritty details instead of looking at the big picture. So when we prepared the same for our own board in October, we backed it up a step to this diagram, which keeps the focus on the four major goals. So
I like this better.
I think for where we're at right now, this is the more instructive and the bigger picture for audiences. Part of our small group discussion later on will be, A, we really need to focus on those big metrics, and then B, what's the best means of going forward to identify the more either leading metrics or supporting building block type objectives that are like these bullet points that fall under the other, that are on the other draft. So I wanted to point that out. Before we go to the next discussion, the staff wanted me to remind you that coffee and pastries are over here. We've moved them against the wall because we're concerned about everybody's health. In the next meeting, we're going to put them on the far wall so that you will walk off those calories as you go back and forth. But
now I feel better.
David, did you have something?
I just want to make a couple of quick points in regard to some of the things you've said. I just want to clarify that the data we've seen is that since the recommended high school program has been in effect, we have not seen an increase in dropouts.
What was that again?
Since the recommended high school program has been in place, we have not seen an increase in high school dropouts statewide. So there's been some talk as though that might have increased. It has not. There are only 80% of the students in high school, last data I saw, are actually in the recommended high school program, so we still have 20% in programs that are other than that. Our staff has done an analysis of the recommended high school program as it currently sits, the 4x4, and there is room to do a career track along with it. There's plenty of room to do that, and we think the community colleges would be a good way to do that. Contextualization is very important. In engineering at the higher ed level at Wright State, a number of years ago, they were having trouble with engineering students dropping out in calculus. They did something very simple. They took problems they'd be working on the junior year, embedded them in the calculus, and they had a huge increase in the number of continuing. Contextualization in every level is important, and you can do that within the recommended high school program. And the final part, I just wanted you to know that I guess 3 or 4 years ago, the board made a modification in the core curriculum so that statistics can be as part of that rather than algebra or calculus. So some of these changes have taken place. There's going to be an evolution, but I just wanted to make sure you knew these things before you went on.
And Fred, there's a model also, the IBEST model that we're using, and it's not only just in San Antonio, but it's starting to spread throughout the country, where you team up an academic person with a workforce person, and you contextualize that experience for those students, has had a tremendous impact on us. In fact, we're expanding that program. We're trying to go to scale on it because it's reducing our developmental education failure rate, for example, because we've had a hard time containing that. So like the IBEST model, and that the contextualization to me right now as a board member that deals with this on a day-to-day basis is vital if we're going to continue having any kind of success moving toward certificate attainment.
And the coordinating board has funded several $1 million of that program. The real goal is to get students to the 8th grade level that are really, it's adult basic ed, and at the same time to leave with an employable certificate at that point, to get them into the workforce as quickly as possible, and it's been very successful.
Well, let me ask Susan Brown and Lee Holcomb to come on up for the next part of our agenda, where we're going to go deeper into a discussion on the proposed major WAVE goals. And just as a reminder, Susan, as you know, is our Assistant Commissioner overseeing planning and accountability. And Lee is Director of the Higher Education Policy Institute, which has been supported and continues to be supported by a major grant from Houston Endowment. So, Susan, are you leading off?
Actually, we're going to let Lee lead off.
Okay.
Well, good morning. Welcome back. I think that the previous discussion set up the WAVE framework pretty well. I'm not going to get into this introductory specifics on that very much. I want to go ahead and mention before we get into the meat of the presentation, this is about a 20 to 25 minute planned presentation from beginning to end. Susan and I are going to be tag teaming all the way through it. We've got an hour and a half on the agenda for this session, so basically that means that I think there's plenty of room for questions on an as-needed basis, or if you prefer to wait as we tag team, that's fine as well, whichever you prefer. We're going to talk about each one of the goals of the of WAVE, and we're going to talk about some strengths and weaknesses, some potential targets, and Susan's going to do the W and the A, the workforce and alignment, and I'm going to do the value and the excellence. Before we get into that, I do want to give it a little bit of talk a little bit about the overall goal that Fred mentioned earlier. This is really the subtext and maybe perhaps even the organizing principle of the WAVE framework, and that is the goal that you all have put in place and discussed, that you mentioned actually in the comments in the previous session, that at least 60% of Texans will have a post-secondary credential by 2030. And it's broken down as you see there. Now, this is, of course, as you've mentioned, based upon analysis that Carnevale and Georgetown has done, that stipulates this is what's required in order to support future economy. Now, One thing that I will point out is that obviously this goal is 2030 because that's the time framework that the council is looking at. But if you take a look at the actual reports that Tony's presenting from Georgetown, Texas is anticipated to require 59% of its workforce by 2020 to have some sort of higher ed credential. So, you need to keep that in mind. And that, 2010 is, the national economy requires about 59% of higher ed credential in 2010. So Texas is going to be about 10 years behind the nation in the overall needs of the labor market needs of higher ed credentials. So I thought that would need, the potential topic of discussion today, looking at the 2030 goal, 60% that's been agreed upon so far, and how that relates to what the reports are saying 2020. Then I'm going to talk in the next couple of slides and compare, where Texas state is relative to comparison states and the nation, and of course the international comparisons. These is data that we've largely presented before. I'm going to present it a little bit differently, again, to get some feedback from y'all on how we should move forward. The next slide. What this is a slide looks over time of the percentage of okay. Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. But yes, sir. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay.
Came from, I missed a lot of meetings, but these countries came from the meeting that we had where we talked about the competitive countries.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of discussion on which countries would be good comparison countries, and these are the ones that were you all arrived at by consensus.
Right.
Yeah, and one additional point, Mr. Giles, is that this is a statewide goal, an overall goal, because the community colleges and universities will contribute to this, but because it's a statewide goal, it also means that part of this will come from people flowing into the state as well. And so that's why we have the 4-1 model that Mr. Heldenfels was talking about, is it's recognized that because of the economy, that our institutions will contribute to it, but it also reflects the overall health of the state in attracting and keeping our graduates as well.
That's extremely critical because the population growth should be taken into consideration for everything we do. And I don't see Texas, the numbers of Texas.
Well, and you have to keep in mind that these estimates, these projections, are based upon anticipated changes in the economy. And now, I don't know to what extent, I think the fracking is sort of a whole new ball game that people didn't really anticipate. Mm-hmm. And I think that brings up a good point that, especially as your economy, I think the changes in the economy accelerate over time, right? So, I think one of the things that I think almost goes without saying is that obviously these are what we anticipate will be the needs in 2030, but our ability to accurately project into the future is going to decrease as the future goes on, right? Because the economy changes, the dynamism of the economy, I think, is increasing over time.
So we need to make sure that is that's a mantra in what we're saying, because and it will change based on what's happening with the growth and the population and the economy, and so we'll always evaluate and we'll change accordingly.
And that's one of the reasons too, Jody, why we focus that goal on a percentage of the workforce population as opposed to closing the gaps where we projected specific numbers.
Thank you for that.
The other thing that I recall about Dr. Carnevale's comments, and maybe this is more refined, but when he talked about the associates and their certificates, he kind of gave a range on the graduate here of 7 to 10%. And I recall him saying that with associates or certificates, it was 10 to 12 or 10 to 13%.
I believe it was 7 to 10%, I think, for the range for graduate associates and certificates. I'd have to go back and look at that.
But yeah, we might want to check that, because my recollection is that it would be at least 10% in those last two. But this is going to be important, because in the past we really haven't broken it down for the public, for the policymakers, as to what, and that will change. That will be dynamic too. That mix of graduate, bachelor, associate, and certificate 5 years from now may be a different projection, by 2030. Okay.
So this is the percent. This graph shows the change over time of the percent of adults aged 25 or 64 with an associate's or higher in Texas and other states. And basically what you see here is that by and large, it's, there isn't a whole lot of upward movement in any state. Now, you've got to keep in mind that these percents are based upon statewide populations. So, any movement, even a percent, translates into a lot of additional people who have an associate's or higher. But what you do see here is that Texas is at the bottom. In between 2010 and 2011, there was actually it starts, I think, in 2009, a noticeable increase in up to scraping to the bottom about 35, maybe 34.7% in Texas. So that's a positive sign. But I think that, compared to New York, which of course is approaching 45%, I think they are pretty much setting the standard in terms of our comparison states of where you want to be. One thing that I want to point out, and I think is a potential topic for consideration here, and this is sort of on the heels of your remarks, Charles, is when I presented this similar data in a previous meeting, I presented the data only for 25 to 34-year-olds, right? And you've seen various figures that break down the higher ed attainment rates by age group, right? And you may recall that that's that figure that shows sort of a stair-stepping effect in a lot of our comparison countries. That is not the case here in Texas or in the United States. So I think an issue to talk about among the council is, how do we actually want to disaggregate, if at all, according to age group. I went ahead and selected the age group 25 to 64-year-old just because that's the age group that most closely aligns to the Carnevale analysis. That doesn't mean that has to be, there can't be a more refined disaggregation of age group for the purposes of the council.
The other thing that is a bit of a disconnect on our metric here is that, I alluded to this earlier, most states apparently are not tracking certificates. Well, so these percentages are associates and above, but they don't include the certificates. But when we talk about our 60% goal, we're including those certificates. So we need to.
Well, you're getting to one of the weaknesses of these measures, in that these are based upon, as you see, they're ultimately based upon census data. And the way the census asks higher ed attainment questions, it doesn't allow you to isolate certificates, right? So that's an inherent shortcomings of the data that we have available to us. Now, I am going to cite some data a little bit later on that's recently come out from Complete College America that gives us some certificate credentialing rates per capita. I'm not exactly sure that gets us to where, that's equivalent to the percent of the overall population that has a certificate. I'm still looking into that, but I'll get into that a little bit later on. Next slide, you see is essentially the same metric, the proportion of the population, 25 to 64-year-olds who have an associate's or higher, and looking at their international comparisons. And what you see there is Texas, again, is scraping 35%, bottom of 35%. You see some remarkable increases over time from 2007 to 2010 in Canada, Korea, the UK. And one thing that I will note is, Korea, if you recall, Korea is that country where among the 25 to 34-year-olds, 60% of 25 to 34-year-olds in Korea as associates or higher, much greater than their older population. So that growth that you see there in Korea is due to that 25 to 34-year-old population. One other thing I will point out is that when I was looking at comparison states, that graph went from 2007 to 2011. This is the 2010. So this is sort of anticipating one of the weaknesses of the international data, in that that's sometimes dated relative to what we have nationally, of course, in the state. Unless there's any questions, I'm ready to go into the next slide.
The only thing I noticed is that the UK did something between 08 and 09. Look at that big jump they took.
UK, big jumps there. UK and then Canada and Korea, I think, are the remarkable countries. And Germany's actually increased quite a bit. I was quite surprised to see Germany at the low end of the distribution. But then again, I think that we might be getting to, this isn't counting certificates. Perhaps if you count certificates, Germany may have a different story.
Yeah, to that end, I've wondered, and I think we need to verify what's happening, but historically, Germany's been well known for developing technicians that would not show up in this data, and particularly, really highly skilled machinists, for example, who do have high-level math skills as well. I mean, they're, at least historically, they've been known as being exceptional in that regard.
I understand that Germany is one of those countries that in high school you make a choice, a trade direction or towards higher education.
I think that's the case in a lot of these other countries.
Mr. Chairman, and it appears to me that, first of all, this international chart is excellent, and you brought up a very good point, how it peaked. But at the end of the day, it would be nice to know the answers to why it increased. And Ray said that he thinks that Germany, between high school and college, they were doing this and doing that. The point is, if there's any way we could find out the answer to the question, it makes us much smarter as we present it to other people, and it also makes us much smarter around the table. If that information is available, I don't know, but those are the questions that was asked around the table are questions that will be asked again.
Well, you're right, and it's also relevant to finalizing the decision on which are the best countries for us to benchmark against.
That's right.
Both because of what they're doing and then as well as cultural similarities.
And I think we particularly need to find out, to your point, Mr. Heldenfels, what happened in the United Kingdom, because we hear a lot about Finland. I have not really heard much about a particular change in the United Kingdom, and I think it is important to find.
But I've also, heard both members of this council and others in talking about this topic talk about the fact that Finland is a pretty homogenous country. Countries like the UK or Australia are a lot more like the United States in terms of racial and ethnic diversity and other education issues. It could be as simple as in the UK, they started counting something they weren't counting before 2009, or it could be some program or funding thing.
And I mentioned this when we presented these slides in an earlier meeting, but the rapid increases like you see in UK really sort of as a researcher make me raise my eyebrow a little bit. I mean, I think there might be some other things going on there. Now, in regards to Australia, from what I understand, they've had some changes in their immigration policy, right, where they're being very selective, from what I understand, in terms of who they allow visas to come into the country. Well, that's driving a lot. And they're a net importer of human capital, and their economy's been doing very well relative to the rest of the globe, and they're being very selective about who they let in. So I think that's a large part of the story there. And actually, that gets back to looking at migration flows and attainment rates of migration flows between states. States like Texas and California and New York that are net in-migration states. The educational attainment profile of those who are coming is by and large greater than the native population. So that basically adds to the overall educational attainment numbers.
Mr. Chairman, and again, I think this brings to light that we need to be very rigorous in terms of how data is collected, and the role of the metrics is going to come out of this council, or that we're going to suggest, is very important, because in my experience in community college, trying to find out what's the condition, in other places, it's hard to get a valid comparison. You look at iPads, the federal clearinghouse, their data will not give you some of the information you need here in Texas, for example. And they've readily admit that. They're busy trying to do something with that. Even between us, it's community colleges, they collect data on, we all collect data on different programming or demographics. So again, I think one of the most important things that needs to come out of this council is that we need to look at how are the metrics going to be developed. And I agree with what Gerry said earlier. What are we going to be measuring, and can we take some of the comparisons we're looking at face value?
Well, in fact, Lee's next slide is to start talking about the strengths and weaknesses of these metrics, but that's exactly what you just described is exactly the purpose of today's agenda. Awesome. Before we move on to talking further about cultural change, and we will talk about what the meetings through the rest of the year should focus on, but before we do that, we really need to come back and consolidate and see what consensus we can build on the wave diagram, so to speak, and not let the perfect get in the way of the possible on choosing those best metrics that we can.
I think those metrics need to focus on what we want for Texas. I understand that we need to compare ourselves with other people, but what do we want for Texas in 2030, for example? What do we need to look at statewide within ourselves? And see if we're making strides.
One thing that I want to make sure I mention is, I mentioned this report by Complete College America that actually has state-by-state statistics on certificates. And they have a measure here, and I'm going to throw this out because I'm not really sure exactly how it's defined and what it means, because it's not defined in the report, and I think it warrants a phone call to someone. But what they've got something called the long-term certificate, long-term certificate awarded per capita, and Texas is about 13.5%. I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Whose report is this?
This is the Complete College America, and this was in 2010. The national average is at 12%, so we're about a percentage point and a half above the national. So I'm not sure if that translates into 13.5% of the overall population, but if it does, then that means our 35 plus 13, we're at about 43, 46% higher ed attainment rates in Texas. But I will have to define that more precisely before we can make any sort of reasonable suppositions.
Okay. Harold?
Lee, when we say certificates, are we talking about just certificates from community colleges?
That's
there's
all
no
private and public.
Undergraduate certificates.
Well, and this statistic I just threw out is from private providers as well. Now, the Texas, 37% of the certificates, according to this report, in Texas come from public institutions.
37%.
37%.
Okay,
right.
so if it's
which is lower than the national
Western
average.
Technical, that's whatever, they're required to report?
They are required to report to us, and then we actually send all the certificate data to Complete College America.
Okay, and so how would, that we were talking earlier about a plumber doesn't want to get an associate's degree or whatever, but he gets enough hours and then passes a state exam to where he's a certified plumber. I mean, there's no accountability for that? He has to get a certificate or either a certificate, I guess, for going to these classes?
It will depend on how it's structured, and I believe community colleges will vary on how they do this. Some, and I don't know enough about plumbing, so, take what I say with that. They can offer certificates 15 hours. So if it's something that requires, 15 hours, or if it's a workforce certificate, there's different levels. So it could be a certificate 1, and they would still get the certificate. It doesn't mean that they don't have to sit for that state standardized test in order to get their license to do the work. Or some of them go through apprenticeship programs. And so if it's an apprenticeship program, they won't have a certificate at all. If they go to a community college, generally they will have some type of certificate saying, okay, I've completed this course, this is what I'm supposed to know, and then they go sit for their license exam.
Well, and there's also the technical colleges.
Well, yeah, TSTC and all the career
so I think
colleges.
this
and
council, and for that matter, the coordinating board too, we need to understand at least two things. Exactly is the definition of what Texas currently measures when we refer to certificates, and then which maybe you can probably explain that now. But
we have definite definitions for what they report to us for.
So secondly, we need to understand what CCII is counting when they say 13.5%. Does that include everything from what you just described to, getting a certificate from the Online Art Institute of Los Angeles because you sent in a, third grade color drawing or something? So it would help us to come to consensus on when does a certificate reach workforce value and how do we measure that?
And we work with the TWC, Texas Workforce Commission, because if a career college is not going to be awarding anything above a certificate level, they only have to report to the Workforce Commission. If they're going to be awarding an associate degree or higher, they report everything to us. So we get their certificates, their associate degrees, all of that information. We then, for the institutions that report to us, provide that information to Complete College America. I don't know enough about this report specifically to know if they also work with the Workforce Commission or get certificate information from individual career colleges. But I know we report all of the public institution data and for those career colleges that we have the information on.
Part of what you're hearing is there are multiple paths, and there are many apprenticeships don't really get counted in what we're talking about. There are ways institutions can work with folks. When I was in New York, NYU, I actually worked with a program that worked with a local union in terms of giving competency-based credit 25 years ago. Many of our universities actually have continuing education programs which are not funded by the state, which in some cases, at least in the past, provided training to people like substance abuse counselors. There's a whole range of things like that that can lead directly to jobs, but aren't part of the traditional system in the way it's understood. And so we need to recognize that and decide whether that's something that needs to be counted or not.
Well, maybe we need to now let you try to get back to making progress through your presentation.
Well, and the next slide is the strengths and weaknesses. I think we've covered them. I would like to just, we're able to capture trends over time. You've got this age group 25 to 64. We can look at 25 to 64 over time. And then the issue is, whether or not that being able to capture trends over time is the way you want to portray this. I think that might be of value given that we're looking at moving into the 2030 as a target. And then the 25 to 34-year-old. I mean, how do we want to break down by grade level, or not grade level, excuse me, by age group? So that is sort of the subtext of the WAVE framework. We're going to move into actually discussion of the WAVE now. I'm going to hand over to Susan.
Okay. And all of you are familiar with the WAVE. It was already shown. And we talk about the relevance of the workforce and the alignment, the value, and the excellence in the programs. For the workforce, one of the major top goals has been, that y'all talked about, has been to improve the percentage of graduates who are employed and or enrolled in relevant fields within 6 months. Currently, what we have for the public universities, it's actually dropped between FY07 and FY11 from 80% down to 77%. For community colleges, from 93%, and this is academic graduates, from 93 to 89%, and technical graduates have actually remained steady at about 90%. Now, part of this shows up, FY11, you're right in the middle of the downturn in the economy. That is obviously plays a role in this. If before people are employed, there have to be jobs available. So this is part of the issues that we have. Go ahead. Go back. Well, and that's something we're going to talk about. That's one of the issues we have with this, one of the weaknesses. Relevant would be, if you get a certificate in plumbing, are you working as a plumber, or did you get a job, flipping hamburgers at McDonald's? If you're got an engineering degree, are you working as an engineer or in a related field? That's what the relevant is, and that is one of the weaknesses we have. So.
And the numbers Susan is showing you doesn't address relevant fields. It
does not have relevant fields, and we'll talk. What is the 80%? Those are people that are students who were employed or enrolled in higher ed, additional higher ed, within 6 months. That is one of the problems.
And then they graduate and they're working at a fast food restaurant. It just shows they're employed.
They're employed. And that's one of the weaknesses. Go to the next slide.
But let's, so and there isn't time to discuss it today, but as you refine these, actually online, Susan and her staff have for every institution in the state by zip code whether students are employed or not and what their income was the first year. So we were surprised the other day to see
gainful employment.
A school up in the Panhandle, English majors actually had a higher starting salary than a school in a metropolitan area did, and you wouldn't think it would work that way. But we have that data for every school. So later on, as you refine this, we can really get into much more detail.
And this is all from National Gainful Employment Act, which links higher ed data and labor workforce data. So we have the salaries, that sort of thing.
Maybe this we could learn from TSTC's proposed funding model. It's not a perfect correlation to relevance, but if there was a way to measure increased earnings, the delta, the hopefully upward change in increased earnings.
And that gets into one of the weaknesses we have with the workforce data. The TWC does not collect occupation. So that's where the relevance comes in. And we have quarterly wages. So we know how much they made that quarter. We don't know if they worked part-time. We don't know if they worked full-time. We don't know if they, it has industry. Unfortunately, if you're an accountant, when you graduate from college, you get an accounting degree, and then you go to work at McDonald's. You could be flipping hamburgers, or you could be the accountant for the whole corporation.
But you could
You're
do what
working in the restaurant industry. That's all we know.
You could do what you're asking in terms of the delta, in terms of increased earnings as a result of the degree.
Over
if they were
time.
employed before, you can clearly do that piece. It might not be in the field, as Susan was saying, but you could see the increase.
Lee?
I've been waiting for the right time to ask this question, but we've already heard a lot about how student trajectories are increasingly diverse. And I wonder if we're not seeking for a level of detail that's going to be very hard to meaningfully measure. We could put a lot of energy into tracking whether each individual student in Texas goes into a field relevant to their training, which I'd love to have as a university official. But I suspect, at least at the statewide level, there's some proxy that works better that'd be a lot simpler. So if you looked at the average wage in Texas and you broke it out, what's the average wage for a person with a college graduate or a post-secondary education? And then you applied this new and improved database to simply whether the graduates are in our economy at or above the average wage, and you track that percentage over time so that programs that improve their focus, improve their workforce alignment, improve their placement, end up with a higher wage relative to the average. You might be better in the aggregate than trying to build something on individual placements. I mean, we have a lot of music graduates at UNT who take their skill with computers and music and go develop apps, and they are very nicely employed in the business world, in the entertainment industry. Now, you'd put a lot of effort into whether they're in music or not, and I would say, what's the point? The economy's moving so fast. Yeah. What's the point of trying to measure that kind of engineering?
And that is one of the things that we've had with the gainful employment. We look at, are they employed and are they working? And what is their salary? We have their salary their first quarter at 6 months out, and then we have a year. We've also actually done a study recently where we look 3 years and 5 years by broad discipline, just to kind of get a feel for how are they doing. We also compare that to their loan amount. How much did they have in loans?
And we're going to 10 years on that as well to see as you accumulate. To your particular point, Mr. Jackson, there was a tech company in Austin that hired specifically music majors, philosophy majors, and language majors to train as programmers to go along with the traditional computer science folks they added, because they were eminently trainable as programmers, but they brought something different to the table. They felt they contributed. And we have looked specifically at liberal arts majors in general, and I've actually been pleased to see, we don't really know what they're doing, and the English major probably isn't working in English, but they are becoming employed, and they have competitive salaries. It's looking better than we would think, and then what you're hearing in the media might suggest for some of those graduates, because the industry's finding useful things for them. And Lee actually, I believe, had a conversation with the liberal arts dean at UT Austin that was talking about sort of a business cluster that you had that conversation, correct, that they were helping develop for liberal arts majors to make sure they were employable when they left. Anyway.
Well, I think that you bring up a great example of why the relevant part of this metric is, it's like our definition of excellence in closing the gaps. It's sort of in the eye of the beholder, and so therefore hard to measure. So I think that's not only a weakness, but it's a fairly major structural weakness. And
we could just change it to employed or enrolled. I mean, because you don't know what's relevant, and we can compare. One of the things that you brought up was you can look at people who graduate with an engineering degree from UNT versus an engineering degree from Lamar or wherever, and are they more or less employable? So that might get to, are they aligning themselves with the workforce around them? Well, workforce so that industry will know, okay, we want graduates from UNT. We want graduates because they have a more relevant training. They have the skills that we are looking for more than another institution.
That brings up one other thing that I'd thought about since we first crafted this wave diagram, and that is we have this under excellence, but would the measurement of learning outcomes and the demonstration of increased learning, as opposed to what the America Drift researchers found, would that be a proxy for workforce relevance and alignment.
We get into that later in the discussion under excellence.
So I think that's another possibility, along with the wage delta that
Well, one thing to consider, perhaps as an additional metric, is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I think, came out with a report about 6 months ago where they look at, as a measure of alignment between education and the workforce, the ratio of earnings of college degree holders versus high school only in the state. The theory behind that is, to the extent that what their students are learning in higher ed is relevant and aligned to the workforce, that ratio is going to increase.
I just, we may need, and Mary Smith spoke to you about this, but I think there's a kernel of something in what we're doing with our voluntary transfer compacts and the tuning that is helping us to look at part of the alignment process. You may recall the survey that was done and where the industry really said which of various components were really critical to their employees. And it sorted things out in a very interesting kind of way, and I think provides good guidance to the institutions in terms of, another language is really important in this field or it isn't, for example, or how important is critical thinking, how important are the communication skills. There's a whole range of elements. You may recall her mentioning that in Utah, a study, when they did tuning, they found that actually there were industries that wanted their history graduates. And what they did was they identified elements in those particular graduates that industry liked and modified their curriculum to make sure all their history graduates had those elements, to make them all more employable, because there were elements of what they're training in history that contributed in ways they hadn't expected.
You might go to the next slide, because I think that addresses, Lee and David, a couple things you were talking about.
Right, and this is where we talked about employer ratings of graduates as some of the possible targets. And we can use the information that we have from the tuning projects. Granted, it's not all the disciplines, but I think it does help as part of looking at the alignment between them. And we can also look at the information that we have on the statewide transfer compacts, looking at how those align, those careers can go through higher ed and on into the workforce, and kind of supplement what we have on the wages and the workforce data to go on to that. Go on to the next. And if there's no more discussion about the workforce, we're going to talk about the alignment. And for this one, we looked at the 8th grade cohort. You saw the information presented by George Granger on what they've been working on, something we've been providing them for years now. We went from 7th grade to 8th grade cohort and looking at it. And from fall 2008, 8th graders going through the process, we've gone from 19%. In the fall 2001, 8th graders, we've gone up to 19.4. You'll see this Y percentage, because this is going to be a goal. That's an area of discussion. Where do we want to see that?
I thought the number that I saw, I thought the baseline was a little better than this. I thought it was 21.9% that the Houston Endowment had published.
That was on a
number included the out-of-state transfer, that estimate they tried to put in there.
NCES, or National Student Clearinghouse data. We had a few years of National Student Clearinghouse data. The 8th graders we now have pushed past the data that we have, so we don't have that out-of-state information at this point. We've looked into trying to get it for only an extra $200,000 a year. National Student Clearinghouse would be glad to sell us that information. So we still don't have it.
Well, since the human...
Best when you're there this afternoon.
Well, isn't Houston Endowment already paying for that information? Because this is their
they did
metric.
not pay for that information. This was information, because we did the work for Houston Endowment. This was data that, actually, I think when Lee was at UT Dallas paid for a couple of years for a research project they were working on, and we were able to use the data. Recently, a little bit more recently in 2008 and 2009, when we get up to that, we'll have a little bit more information. We've tried working a statewide deal with them. We've tried, and apparently Florida has dropped using National Student Clearinghouse because of the cost also.
National Student Clearinghouse, that's called, referred to
NSC.
NSC,
They're the only game in town
Yeah.
with this kinds of data, and they know it.
which is why they can
And
ask
they
200,000.
charge. And so, we've looked at doing it. We do have some of our colleges that track their transfer students, that sort of thing. We're looking at how to get that information from the individual colleges and be able to add it to our database. Right now, I believe the way the MOU is written makes it very hard for them to do that legally, so we're still working on it.
They
We
charge
haven't
on-
given up, but
They charge on a head count basis, so if you're tracking high school graduates, we have more than 200,000 more every year that you have to add into.
and they
that
won't
base.
let you only, we have tried, we'll match them in Texas and then send you the ones that we can't find already, either, in higher ed or employed, and see if they'll do that, but they count it on the entire high school graduating class, no matter what.
Well,
Only game in town, you get to charge what you want.
We actually had this in our legislative appropriations request in a previous year, but it was
Two different sessions.
decided not to pursue it any further. But we have talked about it might be something worth doing periodically to see if that number changes. And so far it's been fairly consistent, the number that are showing up out of state. So we think we at least have a ballpark estimate of that.
And using some of this older data, we actually did a little bit of research on the high school graduates that went out of state, and we kind of tracked them for a couple years. Over 40% actually wound up back in Texas, in higher ed, back in Texas. So, those may be people that went out of state, decided they really wanted to be closer to home and came back, or for whatever reason, for the economics of going out of state, came back. We don't know.
well, if we're going to use this as a metric, we've got to reconcile that 2.5 percentage point gap is a huge, is a big number when you're dealing with less than 20% versus 21.9. So we need to solve that problem, and I don't know whether spending $200,000 is the best way to do it or not, but
That's kind of been our
it's hard to set
dilemma.
our goal of what is that Y percent if we don't have a consistently reported base point, starting point. You want to go to the strengths and weaknesses?
We can go to the strengths and weaknesses.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One of the big strengths is it does go all the way through the pipeline. It looks from 8th grade all the way through completion of higher ed. So that's definitely, we can break it out by race, ethnicity, gender, whether students were economically disadvantaged or not, which is one of the big differences we've seen. If you look at those 8th graders for fall 2001, by the time you get to 10th graders, the economically disadvantaged students, there's over a 10% difference in the percentage of students that are showing up even in the 10th grade. So we're losing them.
They're
Between
dropping out to go to work, aren't they?
They're dropping out to go to work. They stay in the 9th grade, So you're seeing a big differences at the high school level even before you get into those that are going on into college between the economically disadvantaged and non-economically disadvantaged.
Some of them are dropping out not only to go to work. Some of them are dropping out because they can't compete and can't complete that high school degree because of failures.
Well, this is even,
That true?
we're talking
I
at
don't
10th
know.
grade. They're not even making it
To the
to the
ninth.
12th grade. We're just saying they drop out between the 8th grade and 10th grade.
That's right. That's right.
There are a lot of details about this that you just have to be aware of, is that we have found, because we've done this for a number of years from the 7th grade, is that if you look earlier on, it looks like there's some dropouts. But we've discovered that some of those people were not dropouts. They went to private schools which were not able to track. They were homeschooled. And then they show up later in higher education. Then,
Or they show up with a GED.
yeah. Or you have some students, unfortunately, that die. And it's a very small percentage, I would hope. And then you have those students we're talking about at the higher ed level, but it really can happen earlier in that their families move out of state or they move out of state. So if you have the NCHIMs and they show up somewhere in college somewhere, even if they left in the 9th grade, they'll show up in that figure. But we need to realize that there are these small sort of leaks in the system that aren't necessarily bad. But if they show up in higher ed education, the Texas, because the system is so robust, they'll show up again. We found, I think, the first time we did this, 17,000 students that would have looked at as dropouts, but they showed up in our higher education institution, so we recovered them. So that's sort of the robustness of the system. We realized that they really were continuing.
Now, one of the big weaknesses is there's really not comparison data. Florida is the only state that is doing this type of work at all. They're statewide. NCHIMS and the Houston Endowment, they're funding it and trying to get. My understanding is Ohio is going to come on board next year. Will be the first year they'll be able to do an 8th grade cohort. But those are the only states that can do this at this point.
Well, I think, however, if that Houston Endowment and NCHIM's effort is going to, I guess what we want to know is what's their likelihood of successfully bringing in other major states so that this will be a sustainable metric.
Right, and they're working on it. They're working on North Carolina, who apparently has some ability. I think they can go from high school graduates forward. They can't really go back as far as the 8th grade yet. And my understanding is that I think they're talking to Tennessee. I don't know how far along the process they are. So they do have some states. California's not close. Unfortunately, New York's not anywhere close to being able to do this. So the number of states may be small. I do think it's a good measure as far as looking at how we're doing. A 0.4% increase, looking at comparable data, is still a fairly large increase when you're talking about over 300,000 students in a 1-year time frame. So, it can tell you something, even though you can't compare it with other states.
And the big picture is it's the only thing that aligns the whole pipeline as best we are able to do so today.
Because if you look just from high school graduation and forward, you are going to miss what's going on in the K-12. And
so
we have the whole Pathways project.
The small groups will talk about this later, but it kind of seems to me that if our overall goal is 60% of the workforce age adult population, why wouldn't our goal for this pipeline measure be 60%? Or do we take 60% as a starting point but back out those small imperfections like the National Clearinghouse data and whatever other leaks there are and back into a percentage that, when you add those back in, equals 60%?
Well, but part of it is that 60%, we talked about this, includes the in-migration from people coming into the state, so we'd probably need to kind of
so if you're in migration,
parse it out a little bit.
If the attainment of your in-migration average is higher than what our public through our P16 pipeline is producing, you could still come out okay with a lower percentage from this metric. But is that what we want to count on?
Well, and you can do, on the census data, you can look at the attainment rates of native Texans. You can break that out separately as well.
And the importance of this discussion is that there are a lot of nuances to this, and so it's really important, these types of questions you're raising and directions, because then staff has to go out and try to find some of these answers for you. Ms. Williford can tell you that for closing the gaps, there were some basic goals set, and then it was probably a year in terms of trying to really refine those and answering a lot of questions the way you are. And I think the particular goals that you have set before us in the state are really much more challenging, I think, to get at those nuances. And so this is really helpful. And I think Texas sort of set the standard nationally, and I think you heard Carnevale say that most states haven't done much really with the data related to workforce. And so I think even with imperfections in a year, you guys are going to take the state further than most other states are right now in trying to really have a better sense of how to measure these things and what are useful measures. And hopefully they'll improve over the next several years as well, making Texas still sort of a leader. And even in terms of this one, I think as we use this measure more, and other states are striving to develop their systems, they're going to look to this and say that it's something they need to do because they'll begin to see the utility. So they may not do it because they're so far behind in terms of data, but I think it will become a standard in the way closing the gaps has actually influenced the plans in many other states. And the data for Complete College America, most of these other states couldn't do 10 years ago. So I think you're going to influence not only Texas but elsewhere.
Well, and the council members will talk about this more in the breakout groups later, but you touched on something that I think, if we can settle on these major goals, we can rely on staff research to go forward and help us decide what are those building block objectives that help lead up to those major goals. So, and keep us out of the weeds at least for the next three meetings. But.
Thank you.
So that brings me to the next slide, alignment possible targets. I didn't ask this earlier, but are these targets underneath that overall metric that you're suggesting?
Correct.
As opposed to alternative
Right.
metrics?
These are
Okay.
underneath. These are kind of the building blocks for that. And this is looking at, we can talk about the number of voluntary or institutions participating in those statewide transfer compacts. Percentage of students with an intent to transfer who do, and there's some weaknesses built into that. The intent flag, we do collect an intent flag, and the graduation rates and all that are first-time, full-time degree seeking. However, once again, I don't ever say anything without the however part. If a student needs a Pell Grant, they have to be degree seeking or they don't get the Pell Grant. So a lot of institutions will count them as degree seeking to help them get that Pell Grant, and they're really not. So,
Yeah, I
there are
agree. This
weaknesses
is
with
especially
it.
important to community colleges because the intent factor is vital to us. For example, my son went to Baylor, but in the summer he came back to community colleges, and again that hurts us in terms of the way we collect the metrics for where completion and so on. So again, the intent flag or whatever, we're trying to get a hold of that because a large number of our summer enrollment, for example, our flex semesters involves students coming in from UTSA, UT, other schools, and so they skew our success.
They're not included in those percentages, those graduation and completion percentages.
But I think
at
it's a
all.
factor we need to look at in terms of how it reflects on community colleges. I mean, I'm a board member and I'm sitting there and I'm looking at all this enrollment as a degree. It fluctuates back and forth. And so when I asked the chancellor, what was our persistence rate, for example, and we find out that there's a downturn from summer to fall or spring to fall. Always. And the reason is we have this influx of people whose intent is solely just to come in and get some credit for their 4-year degree. The other part of the intent issue is, and I think you said it, I just need 18 hours to enhance my job. And so that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to transfer. I'm not going to graduate. So I think that's a very important issue we need to look at in terms of trying to get to this percentage because, for example, we have a 10% rate for certificates and 10% for associates. Again, we may need to understand what the condition is in terms of programming to get those people to complete so we can get that data. If we don't, then we're not going to have an accurate picture of what we're dealing with.
And I'll go back to what Mr. Heldenfels was saying earlier for the return on investment or return value study that we're doing for TSTC, working on their new funding model. We looked at not only those students who had completed a certificate or associate degree, but we also looked at their leavers.
Right.
And we looked at the differential in salary from before they entered to for 5 years out after they left. And so we didn't just look at the students. So
and I understand
one
that.
of your students who completed 18 hours didn't get a certificate, didn't get an associate degree, but that helped them get a better job or get promoted within the same company or something like that would show up as a increase in the wages.
Well, and again, though, I think one of the things we're going to have to look into as well is what kind of policy positions are going to be required to get this implemented. it's important to say things like, if we want to have completion, then what kind of metrics are going to be required? And then are we going to impose, a certain position on universities or community colleges? One of the key words that I see here on the alignment possible targets is the voluntary part. Mm-hmm. If it's voluntary, we may not get the consistency that we need in terms of data collection. And I know that this is kind of a hard-nosed approach to this, but if we're really going to get some good comparative metrics, we may have to say, this is what we want to get, from institutions, and it's not voluntary. So just a thought, but that's one of the things that's been I've been considering here in terms of what are the policy issues that are going to have to come out of this that we need to ask the legislature to undertake, or each of the, for example, governing boards at community colleges or the board of regents at some of the universities.
I think Chairman Branch actually has legislation that addresses just what you're talking about.
And then especially since we're going
voluntary to mandatory.
Yeah, especially since we're going to go into the performance funding that he's suggesting. How are we going to consistently look at that from college to college and university to university?
Okay. Couple of the other things that we feel are very important is the number of students enrolled. Even though, that's a very straightforward metric, we still need to increase our enrollment no matter what, and number of graduates. And these are, completions, certificates, graduates of any type.
Again, we may need to express it as both number and percentage,
right,
so that it's relevant to the changes in growth trends in Texas.
I'm going to go ahead and talk about value and excellence. Value refers to productivity and efficiency, productivity of students through the pipeline. And the overarching goal is increase the percentage of degrees and certificates earned within 100% of time. And the conventional formulation of that 100% of time is 4 years. And in Texas, we've actually done a pretty good job at increasing the proportion or the percent of degree students who earn a degree who do so within 4 years, from about 20% in 2000 to about 30% in 2011. The corresponding benchmark for community colleges is 3 years. It's not on here, but that increased from 10.8% in 2000 to about 12.8% in 2010. That's a percentage of students who get
2 years.
That's it for community colleges, yes. But they look at that. So the time benchmark for community colleges is 3 years, not 4 years. So we've done, we've got some improvements in Texas over time. If you take a look at the national data, we've got some catching up to do in regards to this metric to some of our comparison states. Washington is 41.1, California is 34.8, Ohio is 30.3. So we're there in the same area ballpark as we are. Mm-hmm.
Why those numbers have increased? I mean, what's happening to?
I would defer to Susan and David in regards to the why.
I think there's been a much bigger focus on graduation rates. I think probably has something to do with it. We have also seen in looking at when you have a downturn in the economy, you don't have as many students who leave and go to work. They just go ahead and stay in. We saw that when the economy was picking up. We saw a lot of students leaving and then
before finishing their degree.
And now we're seeing a lot of students who just stay in. The persistence has gone up because, there's not that lure of going out and finding a job.
But
I think to credit...
What got me thinking about that was that you had a drop-off in Texas grant funding. Mm-hmm. This data is before that.
Right.
And so I'm just curious, is the reduction in Texas grant funding, is that going to reduce the number of people who graduated in 4 years? I would say yes. But I don't know.
I don't know. I would love to tell you, but
there's a whole range of factors, and I think we need to give some credit to the institutions. Is that and the association with Closing the Gaps, there's been a huge emphasis on realizing that you needed to move away from what was sort of the history of public universities in colleges nationally is the students enroll, we let them in, but it's up to them to finish, and we play a critical role in helping them finish. That's more like what the private schools do. And so with the 6-year rate, we continue to hear complaints about whether that's fair or not, but our institutions at universities have dramatically improved that in the last 7 years. We're seeing improvements in community colleges, even though someone brought up intent earlier. But, the intent is hard to get at. We have a measure for intent, but virtually everyone says they want to get a degree, but in reality, we know that's not true. But so it's harder for that measure to go up because the mission is broader for community colleges. But there are things from better advising to the core curriculum we think is getting more focused. We still have work to do there. We're not where we need to be in terms of transfer, but the success in transfer has increased. We have to acknowledge that while we still have too much developmental ed, because of the recommended high school program, we have more students coming to college who don't require the developmental, a higher percentage of students don't require developmental ed, and when they do, they require less. So we've typically lost students in developmental ed because they've become discouraged. There's a whole range of things that happen, and I think it's important to realize that there isn't one critical measure alone. The efficiency group last year recommended a degree plan be put into place. After 30 hours, the legislature adopted it at 45. We believe that will make a critical difference because we discovered many thousands of students had no degree plans at their institution until much later. So it's hard to be efficient if you're not meeting with an advisor and having to get a degree plan in place, even though you can still change it, but at least you have to think about what courses you take. So I think it's important to give institutions credit for making these numbers change because they've done some important things.
During this period of time that most institutions went to a tuition charging program that if you took fewer hours, you paid more per semester credit hour.
Correct.
Yes.
And the more you took, that cost per semester credit hour dropped dramatically. And you started seeing increase in the number of semester credit hours taken by students immediately.
That's right.
Immediately. Flat rate tuition has played a large part of that.
I can say anecdotally, when I was a student at Texas, 2 different Texas public institutions, it cost the same whether you took 12 hours or 18 hours. And though at my undergraduate institution, most people graduated in 4 years because they saw the economic incentive. They weren't going to take 12 hours when they could get 2 more courses for the same price. So their grades were a little lower than they might have been, but there was incentive. And the more we see that happening in institutions, many students will make a good economic decision and take one more class a semester.
The change was dramatic within 1 year.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's another element here, and you kind of touched on some of the elements. The Student Success Initiative in the community college arena has really focused for us what we need to do in those areas. So that is, I think, has had a lot of import. For example, we require a degree plan now, but it's not in 30 or 45 hours, but 15 hours in, you've got to have a degree plan in. And that's how we're dealing with the intent part of this. Also, our board just, this last year, invested about $1 million in advising to amp up the advising part of this. And last night, for example, we heard a presentation from Palo Alto where we now have a full mandatory orientation to incoming students. And they're assigned an advisor. By the time they leave us, they have their schedule. They have everything they need to be successful. And then there's follow-up throughout their first year for sure. So I think that's going to help get to a 3-year attainment goal that we have. And it's also going to help us with our transfers. Also, we're working very closely with the universities in our area to have reverse transfers, to keep in touch with or have agreements for them to let us know when they're receiving our students, and we can start following up in terms of our success rate. So there are a lot of things happening out of that Student Success Initiative I think that we need to look at. It's very, very vital to community colleges and what we're doing right now.
But this underlines why your work is so important here, because the decisions you guys make in terms of setting goals and once they're set is going to drive work, because closing the gaps clearly did. This is taking some similar but different directions. And then the institutions will find the ways to make it work for their students at their institutions in meaningful ways. And so, you are going to set the standard for another decade by your decisions here.
And Mr. Chairman, the thing we have to consider is all of a sudden things are starting to change rapidly in terms of what is perceived to be a college, for example. The college without walls. I mean, we're looking at all kinds of different structures that are being set. For example, I was talking to the Vice President the other day, and he's talking about trying to preserve his venerable institution. And I told him very clearly that may not be the reality in 2030. And so that's another element that we need to look at in terms of the resources that are available to students nowadays.
Lee, I don't know if it was you or David, someone mentioned some example states. Washington at 41.1%, are they the high water mark?
Of our comparison states that I looked at, yes. You've got Pennsylvania at 39.7.
So I guess a couple of data points. Pennsylvania's 39.7. So, we could talk about setting a goal that would equal or exceed those high water marks. We can also look at, the past 11 years, we increased 10%, almost 1% per year. Of course, I don't know how linear that was, or if there was I assumed it probably wasn't. But is it reasonable over the next 15 to 17 years to keep that pace up and add 1% per year approximately, or 10% per decade, or whatever that we want to describe it? So just a couple of data points that jump out at me as we decide where we want to set that target initially.
And I believe UT Austin has set a goal to dramatically increase their 4-year rate. And just given the number of students, that's going to help us a lot in Texas get to this point. And I suspect A&M will go in the same direction.
Do any of these states that we're using kind of benchmark, do those states have a performance-based or outcome-based funding?
Well, in Washington, they do.
For the community colleges.
Mm-hmm. And yes.
In Ohio.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know what those trends are over time. I could get those data and look at how their trends, sort of like we did on the higher attainment rates, look at trends over time for Texas compared to the other states.
All right. Want to continue to strengths and weaknesses? Or did you have more on this?
Another opportunity we have to look at another formulation we could consider is semester credit hours to degree. In the discussions we've had on what a degree cost a degree, obviously semester credit hours degree is a major determinant of that. And so, in which case the benchmark would be, of course, 120 for most degree plans. And in Texas, among 4-year graduates who entered in the fall of 2004, almost 28% graduated with 120 semester credit hours or less. And among 2-year graduates who entered in the fall of 2004, about 21% earned an associate's with 60 semester credit hours or less. So that's an additional measure we could consider. The strengths and weaknesses. The strengths for looking at time to degree. National and state comparisons are available for time to degree. Those data are available through iPads and pretty widely used and widely known. We don't have those data for the international comparisons. When we talk about semester credit hours to degree, one of the strengths is that accommodates a part-time student, which I think sort of touches on previous discussion that we had here. I mean, you could have a part-time student who takes 6 years to get a degree, but only 120 semester credit hours, right? They may be very focused, very motivated, but have to work at the same time and aren't able to enroll full-time. So that accommodates that type of student. One of the drawbacks of using semester credit hours to degree, of course, is that we don't have international or national comparisons. So that would be something that we're using just here in Texas.
And one other point to remember in terms of time to degree, and especially if a graduation rate wherever employed is Texas, is in, again, that handful of states that includes students who graduate from an institution somewhere in the state, even if it's not the same one where they began. The federal numbers only reflect those that graduate from the same school. And in Texas, we know, for universities, it's going to be 8 or 9% more. For community colleges, they might take anywhere from 3 to 70 or 80 hours there and not get a degree, but still get a degree from a university, and our system accounts for that. So we have a better understanding of the real success of our students.
And then finally, the strength of using for Texas institutions for both time and semester credit hours to degree, similar to what Susan mentioned from one of her measures, we can disaggregate by a lot of different things in our data in Texas. By field of study, we can disaggregate by type of student, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of flexibility we have in Texas where we don't necessarily have in looking at the national data. And then when you're looking at the possible targets, I just want to sort of review what we've discussed in previous sessions. This is largely rotating around the whole idea of cost to degree, efficiencies. For when you're looking at the international comparisons, the best available data that we have really are looking at education-related expenditures per student and higher education attainment rates, of course, which we've been discussing in this session. When looking at domestic comparisons to other states, we do have some data on education-related expenses per degree. And what we've done in Texas is look at the peer groups in Texas and looking at how the peer groups in Texas, like research, emerging research institutions, et cetera, compared to their peer institutions nationally. And if you recall, we're looking pretty well when it comes to the national comparisons. And then looking at the analysis that uses the vast amount of data that we have available here in Texas, we developed the cohort cost to degree measure that was we've talked about as a basis for what a degree should cost in the future.
Let me just ask, Mr. Chairman, is our goal to be concerned with the total cost of the program from a management, taxpayer, state point of view, or is it cost to the student in terms of affordability, access, and creating more opportunities? Because you'd track it differently if you wanted to give credit for all the financial aid in the system and everything else, and you looked at student cost than if you look at total cost.
In the way that Lee has done the research so far, we're measuring both. If I remember right, for instance, the total cost to a bachelor's degree for Texas, was this bachelor's or was this associates and bachelor's combined?
Well, we've got the undergraduate was the total cost was about $67,700.
Right. And
that's just bachelor's.
That was just bachelor. So that isolated bachelor's is about $67,700. And in very rough numbers, that disaggregated to be around a third, 30% to a third was student cost, around a third was state cost, and around a third was other, which included institutional financial aid, for example. And so by doing it that way, the thought was it allows you to not only measure the total cost of a degree, but the share of that cost in those three sectors, if you will.
Well, I guess I might be asking a broadly philosophical question about how we envision using this successor to closing the gaps. There have been, as you know, some applications of closing the gaps. The legislature, as I recall, or maybe I guess the coordinating board sponsored the evaluation of past tuition revenue bond proposed projects about whether or not they, quote, met closing the gaps goals. So the more precise you make these closing the gaps goals, the easier it's going to be to score whether the institutions are in fact responding in a positive way. do they or do they not get points for a new building because it helps meet closing the gaps, or now they would help meet the wave? Well, I would say, what about an institution whose costs went up, but they so increased their financial aid that their student costs went down? If you're going to use this to incentivize or reward or give a report card or use it as a monitoring and discussion, it seems to me there might be a different set of metrics that are the public goals, and then there are others that may be managerial, that may be state policy goals. So obviously you're going to have a reason to track both total cost and student cost, but some of them may help support and drive your overall student success goals, and you want to make that a set for certain purposes, a simpler set.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Good point.
The other thing to bear in mind is that the biggest initial efficiency we could gain in driving down cost to degree, and it would affect both student and public cost, is increasing the rate of completion. A lot of that, whether it's formula funding, whether it's financial aid, a lot of that is spent on students who drop out of higher education.
Isn't it roughly a third of that 67,000?
Right, but just right under a third
is due to non-completers, adding to the costs that don't end up with a degree. And if you can get that up or get the non-completion rate down, then you could seriously impact that cost.
Well, I guess the point I was not so artfully making is if we have 4 simple, clear, bold goals, and we have for each of them a very small number of key metrics, 1, 2, no more than 3, that are going to be up on a bright light, very visible on the website, clearly the core of all our institutional reporting and policy discussion. You may have, as a coordinating board, 100 more that flesh those out, that are more process-oriented, that go into detail, that sub-aggregate, that look at total cost breakdown and so forth. But I think we need that simple dashboard for each of the 4, and that's why I'm just saying it's sort of 2 different incentives. Either hold down total cost or concentrate and give a priority to holding down the cost to the student.
No, I think that's well said, Lee, and you described exactly what I hope our end product is, which is, simple key metrics on a dashboard that become the focus for the state. So that's where we're aiming. And I think, and I guess what I was trying to say is that one of those keys to me is not just holding down cost or artificially cutting spending, but by improving productivity, get more bang for what we are spending, and that drops the cost per degree because we're getting more students to complete. To me, that's kind of the end game in value, and so we can ask ourselves in the breakout groups: does that increasing that percentage who graduate at 100% of allotted time, is that the best? Is that the right overriding goal for this category?
Well, I've always liked the idea of a block grant for Texas grants. We ought to be given an incentive to go out and figure out a way to use those financial aid resources more effectively. There is a productivity issue about all the sunk cost in students that don't complete.
That's right.
Could we have a dashboard that looks like a '63 Chevy instead of?
My son may even look at that
interesting.
one.
The thing that I observed when we made the presentation to coordinating board is that we were trying to do this high-level stuff that you guys are talking about, but everybody wants to drill down into the details, just like we've done to Lee today. I mean, it's just natural. You want to say, well, okay, well, I understand that part, but can you tell me also? And of course, that's when you get in trouble.
Well, that's why my hope is that this council will do a lot. It will make a lot of progress on polishing this thing before we, quote, take it public, and people start shooting holes in it. 5 more slides.
Moving on. So looking at the strengths and weaknesses, just very briefly, basically the international and national measures that we have that I just discussed are, the best available. They're not really getting at exactly what we want to know in terms of being able to improve moving forward, that is best left up to our state data, the state cohort cost to degree analysis that we've done. But the state cohort cost degree analysis that we've done, we don't have any comparisons to other states to look at. Sort of in the same boat as the workforce data. It's basically an artifact. Our capability to do that analysis is an artifact of the great data that we have, that not most states don't have. And then lastly, excellence. The overarching goal for excellence is to ensure 100% of students demonstrate competence in their field. But I've also included research on this slide, and largely because in the discussion of the presentation to the board, there was quite a bit of discussion of both topics. So I think an issue here is to decide, what the overarching goal should be. I wanted to go ahead and put both on there so that we make sure we have the opportunity to discuss that. This is, the goal for which we have probably the weakest quiver of arrows to actually address. When it comes to looking at student learning, and Fred, you mentioned this before, we really don't have any existing direct measures for every field. Even looking at general learning outcomes, we're still grappling with that. Now, we do have, perhaps some what we could call indirect measures. The workforce, that operating on the assumption that the more students learn in college, the more they're going to actually earn, and the more likely they are to get a job. Of course, then there's the employer surveys. So that's really, I think, the crux of the issue when it comes to looking at excellence in terms of teaching and learning. We did talk briefly when it comes to looking at general learning outcomes, the Student Learning Compact. This was a couple of meetings ago, basically would entail a commitment by institutions to develop a plan that would lead to valid measures for student learning within a given time frame. That concludes almost my analysis. Strengths and weaknesses of research expenditures. This is really a carryover from the Closing the Gaps. I think is pretty widely known by the council members here. I think the only weakness comment I would make is that that some of the national data are at times dated. Apparently, I think Susan could actually speak to that.
Dated. Always dated.
Yeah, they're not at times. They're always lagged
dated
by 4 years or more.
I mean, we do obviously have good national data to look at once they do come out. So that concludes my presentation.
On this topic of excellence, I think we as a state have got to come up with a way to measure learning outcomes. And some of my recent reading, I'm told that there are, I don't know whether it's a handful of states or several states.
Lean forward.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if it's a handful or several states, but a lot of states use the CLA to measure learning outcomes. And here in Texas, the University of Texas uses the CLA through the whole system. So there's already a sort of a critical mass to some degree using the CLA. Most articles I read say right now it's the best available measure of learning outcomes. Why would we not recommend going to using the CLA?
Well, I think that one of the things that you need to think about when you're looking at learning outcomes is to what end, right? So there's a couple of broad purposes for learning outcomes. One is for institutional improvement, and the other is really sort of a signal of what students know upon exit, right? So, the CLA is a good example, I think probably the most widely used example of sort of the standardized approach, right, of looking of capturing general learning outcomes. The concern about the CLA is that it's very difficult to tie the CLA back to actually what's going on in classrooms. right? So you may have, upon exit, a measure of what, critical thinking skills of students. But to make that leap between those results and what's going on in the classroom is very difficult for institutions to do, because it's very difficult to tie, where do you learn the critical thinking, right? I mean, was that done in the first year? Was that done in the second year? There's also issues of, when do you actually capture, or actually capture educational impact of the institution? So do you administer the CLA to all incoming freshmen and then again to all graduating seniors and look at the difference between the two? That's a very robust approach. I think what most institutions do is do a sampling of incoming students and then a sampling X number of years later and look at the difference. There's lots of methodological issues with that approach. There's been some recent research and some not so recent research that shows that student performance on the CLA and other standardized exams is as much a function of the motivation of the student as it is the actual content.
Okay, let me add, that's sort of getting into the weeds a little bit. The CLA is a good measure of critical thinking skills and writing skills. The shortcoming is this. It addresses in no way if you graduate in engineering or accounting, do you know engineering or accounting? That's the weakness, and you just need to understand that. But industry, for as long as I remember, has always said that the things that they tend to be missing are critical thinking skills, communication skills, and ability to work with other people. But I think the things Lee has mentioned can be overcome. In fact, there's a sort of a second wave of the CLA that's being tested in the UT system right now with its originators, the Council for Education. But there still is this limitation. So I think the real issue is, if you understand that, I think it's workable and you can overcome these other things. But don't make the next leap. The book our board heard from the author of a study that said how little students are learning in college. Well, that was based on the CLA, but didn't address, and I think it probably was inaccurate, in that I would think that students, if they were in engineering and graduated in engineering, had actually learned something. They may not be good enough to work for Mr. Messer at that point and his group, but at least they know more about engineering than they did when they started.
But in a lot of those professions, we have proxies. We have the bar exam, we have PEs, we have CPAs for that field content knowledge.
Exactly. So my real point is you have to realize it does this, but it doesn't do the other, and so you would need other proxies if you want to do that. And since so much of what you're talking about is a little bit more workforce oriented and what you know in your field, it doesn't quite get at that. But it's a simple exam approach compared to some others, and does get it. One criticism of many engineering programs is that students can't write or communicate very well. So for engineering students, that's can actually be a nice addition. But Mr. Messer and other equivalent groups really need to have some way through these other approaches to determine that is this someone I want to hire or not.
I'm a little nervous about these testing. I'm sitting here watching what's going on through K through 12. I think every superintendent that you talk to would tell you that he wished they'd never gone down that testing path. The legislature pushed it, other people pushed it, but the legislature has just beat them up on their funding because your schools, you don't have enough schools doing X. They'd rather everybody didn't know that. I'm sitting there thinking about how so much of this data will be used against you in a negative way.
There also, and it's more costly, but actually we have a number of institutions that use CAP, which is a different measurement. So the A&M system actually has a large number of schools that are measuring outcomes. The Texas State system does as well. I'm sorry, I don't know about North Texas.
Using different instruments?
Using different instruments and doing it a little bit more based on specific courses. Then you have a whole other approach that tends to be used by smaller institutions, which is capstone courses in their major, senior theses, actual projects that get at, sort of the culmination. Are they able to bring together what they learned in their field in a meaningful way? That's a costlier approach. That's probably the most effective, but It's probably too costly to employ in public institutions, but privates use it very effectively.
Portfolio approaches are
portfolios,
used, right?
yeah.
And they take samples of students as students progress through the pipeline, and they assess critical thinking, for example, freshman year versus sophomore, junior, and senior. And so they've got these measures over time. It's much easier to relate those measures to student experiences as they progress.
My youngest daughter will have to turn in a writing portfolio at the end of her sophomore year before she can go into her senior year to demonstrate from her previous courses to the faculty that she's able to write effectively. But that's something you can do at a small private school. That takes. If you have a few thousand students, it's very hard to employ.
Well, the groups can discuss this, but we may have to make a decision on, yes, we want to measure the qualitative increase or improvement in learning outcomes, but then, leave it to staff to help us with researching what would be the best methodology to pursue that. It is a little after 11:30, so we're at the point for breaking for lunch. And lunch is over here in the Tejas room. And then the small group discussions will start at noon. So we'll break into the groups, which I think there's a list in your blue notebook of.
Do we need any of this? Do we need to take any of this into the room?
We're going to have the small group discussions back in here again. So, yeah, whatever notes or materials you want to reference,
okay.
Take them with you. That's a good idea.
Am I in your group? Where's our groups?
The Houston Endowment calls it the number, was if we were choosing between the four major goals, the one we felt was of primary importance. And originally, and I don't know, in talking with staff, though, of course we went on to the other goals because where we hope to get is what are the most important, what's the best, most important measure for each of those four categories. But in alignment, we felt the number is good. The question we still have is, where do we set that target? If we're at 21.9% today with the National Clearinghouse data, then do we set the goal at 60%? I think that's part of the process. We'd like staff to do some research and come back with a recommendation on where to set that number for 2030. I don't know that we have enough information to set it today. We'll see what the other groups came up with. And then we spent a lot of time talking about workforce and excellence, a little less time on value because we felt value could stay defined as it is, but we wanted to, so I'll jump down here, we wanted to, as part of the supporting goals, capture the idea of measuring adults who have some college but never completed any attainment at all, and measure bringing them back in to education to complete something. And
that number is so huge. It's 3,200,000 according to boards.
And probably a necessary component to get to that overarching goal of 60% of adults holding an attainment. On workforce, we felt that the measure that had originally been defined needed work, and the one that we felt would be a better primary metric for workforce was to measure the earnings increase after graduation. First we were talking about the minimum wage, but we changed that to earnings versus the U.S. Chamber's benchmark for median wages of high school completers. The U.S. Chamber tracks that wage data, what an average high school student, a high school graduate earns without any post-secondary education. And so
is that for Texas or nationwide?
Well, they track it by state, correctly?
By state and national.
Okay.
It's basically census data.
Well, that's a good question. I think, and Charles or Ray jump in here, but
figure out a baseline. We want to figure out some increase from what? Part-time, some don't.
So which one are you proposing, state or national, that we?
Well, I think Texas.
Okay.
It seemed you'd take whatever the median high school graduate wage for Texans is. And then in excellence, we focused on the restatement of the excellence goal, which was to ensure global competitiveness in both teaching and research. But we had a debate, probably more so over this than anything, about, all right, how do we measure the teaching component of that? On research, we felt that measuring and setting goals for patents, commercialization, as well as total research dollars was important. We talked a little bit about trying to calculate a return on investment, but Charles made a good point that basic research, the timeline for it to show value can be 100 years. I mean, so we kind of stepped back from return on investment and talked about those metrics there. And then in terms of undergraduate teaching or education, we went back to what had been a workforce goal because we couldn't agree on the best way to measure learning outcomes or whether that was fraught with unintended consequences. So we decided that a good proxy measure would be the percent employed or enrolled within 6 months, period, and not referencing relevant fields or getting into those weeds. The theory being that if institutions are competitive in the marketplace, that their graduates will find employment, and when you compare institutions to institutions or state to state, that the relative numbers would be meaningful. So those were what we came up with for measures. As far as process, we felt that we did identify some of the bullet points and scratch out a couple we didn't think were as relevant, and that we would kind of hand off those supporting goals to staff to research. We would also ask staff to continue researching best practices in measuring learning outcomes so that we don't completely drop that, but do some more work to find if there's a relevant way to make measuring learning outcomes meaningful, easily trackable, and also not cost prohibitive or have unintended consequences like Charles is concerned that it might be used against institutions in the legislature. So that's kind of, we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about process beyond those two things. Questions for group one? Who's up for group two?
Lee wanted to be the group leader since he grabbed the pen.
Well, Charles was teasing me so much about having lost every idea I suggested in October. I'll show you how to win. You grab that red pen. So we ranked alignment number 1, like everybody else, workforce number 2, but we had a big showdown over how to rank 3 and 4. The argument, is what good is it to have a productive, low-cost system drives everybody through quickly, time to degree, if you reduce quality? So we went back and forth, and we compromised that values number 3, as long as you understand that we achieve value through productivity, not through reduced quality. So don't know how the system will capture that, but that was our decision. So on our top priority, we had 2 suggested measures. Actually, alignment is the one area where the goal itself is the measure. It's the best single measure of whether we're going to meet that primary measure. It's just hard getting the database. I do think if the database continues to be difficult, where'd Susan go? If that data set is not accessible, then there might be other interim milestones where you don't go all the way back to 8th grade. You start looking at how many 12th grade students take the SAT, ACT, how many fill out FAFSA, how many enroll first year, what's your first year retention. You could come up with some intermediate measures. And the one we talked about was, this works statewide, I don't know if it works regionally, but comparing the number of high school 12th grade students, public and private, to the next year's number of first year enrollees post-secondary, capturing all trade schools, community colleges, universities, and you compare those 2 pools and you see if there's a ratio over time where you try to make the numerator and the denominator as close as possible, at least in the aggregate, that you capture all of them. Workforce, we talked about whether degrees awarded is a primary indicator of whether we're responding to the workforce need, and suggested maybe using the critical fields that's now become a part of the outcomes measure. So if the state's going to incentivize us to issue degrees in critical fields, it's presumably because that has some relationship to workforce needs. And so then you could shine a bright light on that about all the credential issuers and degree issuers, community college, universities and others in critical fields. And then we also talked about whether the graduates are employed in Texas in the database, in the system, above the mean regional wage. And that may be U.S. Chamber's measure or somebody else's measure. But regional is important because obviously wages in Texas vary a great deal. If I can make this hold up, we use the backside. Value, we had both total cost of the degree and the student cost of the degree. We had the percentage of students completing their credential. Again, that's associate's, bachelor's, certificate without excess time or semester credit hours. Degrees awarded. David, have you heard about the ASCU new model? They've asked all their members nationally to calculate. I know Jesse Rogers and Midwestern have talked to us about it, but it captures the transfer students that don't always get captured in the traditional 4-year, 6-year graduation rate, because they've come up with a formula where they divide the semester credit hours issued in total against the degrees awarded, and they keep track of that ratio year to year, and it supposedly captures all students more than the traditional graduation rates. The associate's degree, many community colleges are now using the percentage of their students who complete an associate's degree as a meaningful measure, whether they set a goal, whether they require it, but it's at least a measure that's more important than it used to be. So the percentage getting an associate's degree could also be tracked. Excellence is the hardest one, of course, to measure. We talked about the first-time pass rate on all the professional exams, nursing, engineering, education, CPA, medicine. That gives you a sample of some of your most high-profile, most critical academic fields. CLA, where it's used, or other measures for those that are not using it. Research dollars, either comparing ourselves to ourselves and just simply tracking the percentage increase in Texas, or tracking our percentage of the national R&D. And you can both track national federally funded research. There also may be a way to look at corporate R&D. I know we've just done that in the Dallas-Fort Worth area using Bain, I think, to get the databases to try to figure out how much of our own corporate community R&D is being invested regionally. And the answer is not very encouraging, because that money goes where they think the quality is. But if we make it move over time, if we improve our research platforms in our universities so that corporate R&D comes in a greater percentage to Texas, completely separate from the basic research investment of the federal government, that's sort of a separate measure that's more market related and it's private sector directed. It's just a little bit harder to get that data. That's group 2.
The only problem with the federal data is it's so old by the time we get it.
Lagging indicator, but 3 years later you know if you're moving in the right direction.
Before I begin discussing this first question, we looked at the 4 wave components and decided that it was real hard to make a distinction between which was the most important, because they're all interrelated and they all have their own merit. But we did come up with alignment as our number 1 issue, and that the only concern there was the 8 to 12 spectrum. That was an area that we don't have as much control over, and so that was discussed as a possible issue. Of course, then value came in after that, and then in terms of excellence, we felt it was really difficult to measure in terms of quantifying it. However, that it should be involved in or inculcated into every aspect of this model that we're looking at. The workforce aspect of this, we debated about the need to move degrees into a very specialized kind of expectation or job. And we had discussions, and we basically ended up talking about family. Some of our own children had gotten degrees and that did not lead to a job, but they're doing very well and being very productive citizens. And so that's why it didn't have a high priority as some of the others, because learning is learning, and the ability to learn and to exercise that quality does not necessarily lead to or leads to good performance in the workforce. The next area, I think Pam is the one that led us in this discussion more than anybody else because of her experience with the Closing the Gaps effort. And that was, when do we generate the buy-in into this model? At what point? Since we've been discussing this, we have not gotten inputs from schools or anything of that nature. So at what point do we get the buy-in? Because this is going to be a very critical part of this goal setting that we're doing, and that is, are the institutes of higher education going to buy into this? Are they going to have input into this? How is it going to look after it goes through their systems? The other thing is, in terms of metrics and looking at objectives and further breaking this down, we basically decided that was something the staff would have to do and bring to us because they have more contextual knowledge about that, especially in the metrics area. And so if they could do that, then we can kind of go through that. But we didn't get as specific as some of the rest of the groups did because of that. We felt that was something that the staff could have the ability to do and could probably do a better representation of what needs to happen there. So, Gerry, Phil, Pam, anything else?
Just one thought that, in my view, and I'm glad Pam brought it up, because I think the strength of Closing the Gaps was getting the institutions to buy in and not mandating how they were to do it once they did buy in, because all these institutions are different. They start from different points, and I think it was one of the real, it took a lot of time, it took committees and subcommittees, and eventually Don and Brown and Pam actually went to the majors, I guess, more the regional universities and the big ones and the boards. So that in this whole process, you probably thought about it, Fred. I would guess, but we haven't talked about how we make that happen. Really important.
I mean, that's a great point. We've talked about it, but very briefly. We do reference it on the timeline that was part of the presentation that was done back in October, and we've just started. Really just dipped our toe in the water of doing this. When Raymond and I have had the opportunity to visit with a couple of boards toward the end of the year, subsequent to that October 25th coordinating board meeting, we used the wave diagram to kind of give a picture of where the vision for 2030 was headed. I think we've said that 2014, although we don't necessarily want to wait till 2014 to start, but that's where we kind of hope to vet and bring to consensus the buy-in, during 2014 before we get into 2015, so that we're ready to launch the new long-range plan. At the same time, we hopefully will be celebrating accomplishing most of Closing the Gaps. That's sort of the broad answer.
I was really referencing Fred to have some of this institutional feedback early in the process, not at the end, so that some of these metrics or ways we measure, or there are a lot of good ideas out there. We've got a huge system, as we all know, here in this state with a lot of great minds working in them. And I was getting ready to ask it when we brought for lunch, is there a mechanism in place that, we do get some feedback and some reaction and some ideas, frankly, rather than at the end saying, here it is, now we want you to buy in. can we get some reaction in the short term from the institutions, because I think they also can address some of these questions we're talking about. I mean, regarding data, regarding a lot of them are collecting things that we aren't even aware of that could be very helpful in the process, I think. And I think some reaction sooner than later would be a good thing.
I concur. And we do have some mechanisms in place, and they can be augmented. I know we have for at least the past 3 years or so, and this is just one mechanism, we've had regional meetings kind of from late spring through Labor Day, early fall, all around the state, in which the institutional leadership and stakeholders are invited to attend. I think what I would anticipate is that once we use the mostly consensus we've built here today to sort of update this one more time, then we're hopefully the outcome of this meeting will be to have this at a point where we can begin doing what you're describing. There's also a chance we may be asked to testify on this again. This was one of the interim charges for house higher education, if I remember right. So they've seen the early version of this chart. That may, they may want a progress update later during the session. But I think you're exactly right. Part of now asking the staff to take this forward and vet some of the metrics, and particularly these supporting objectives, then engaging, the institutions for stakeholder feedback needs to be part of that process.
Thanks. Well, I figured it was part of the thinking. I mean, we also talked about, when you're talking about gathering data and metrics, like I said, we don't want the unintended consequences, but we also, need to see, again, one of my things I always talked about when I was chair was, we can't be all things to all people. And what are the most important things we can measure, and what are we going to get the most information from? Because the systems and the institutions, as we all know, are every session, and the coordinating board comes out with more mandates without more money.
Right.
And which of these metrics do we have access to that aren't going to cost a lot more money? Which ones are going to give us the most important data, and which ones are going to prove to be the most consistent, as we go forward. And I think that, I certainly hope that and plan that this will have the same shelf life and longevity and emphasis that we hope Closing the Gaps did. And I think that we need to be careful not to be asking so much of the institutions in data collection, where is it really going to make the most difference, and what are those data points, and how can we help get them without having be, like I said, all things to all people and then not using it, and it costs a lot to do.
I don't think I hope we got that word for word, because I don't think I could add anything to just what you summarized. That's exactly how the process needs to go forward. And that's why I think most of the groups were trying to stick to the KISS principle and identifying, the most meaningful, but also, the measurements that are most easily gathered and tracked and relevant in terms of comparisons. So I think that's really well put.
Yeah, one more point, and I'm going to. My group will get tired of hearing this because I've said it. I said it twice, I think. I really do think that because of the national data and the international data being so late, usually, so lagging, questionable the source it came from and what it means, a la like we were talking today about the UK data, what happened, and they obviously didn't increase something. Something changed in there that they did probably in the data. That I think the best thing we can do is to get the things we want to measure and do them as well as we can, measure them as well as we can, and set about then to goals to improve those metrics. And let the comparisons, obviously we keep an eye on it, but don't let it drive our policy. We've got to we've got to increase the metrics in areas that we know fit Texas and that we've got enough data to play with and make it meaningful. And I think our comparison to the national, other states, and to the international community will take care of itself if we improve the state of Texas and not focus on that as being what's driving us. In other words, what I'm saying is some people will stand up and say, well, we're not as good as Indiana, or we're not as good as... Look, we're working our problem as a state here. We're going to make it as good as we can based on these metrics. Stand by. Just stand by. We're not going to respond to every other state's way of doing business. We've got our own situation. We've got to deal with it. Anyway, end of speech.
Duly,
We've heard it 3 times.
duly noted.
It's a whole other country.
Any other sort of closing remarks or directives for how we go forward on this? It's also a good segue to something I guess I was supposed to address between 9 and 9:30 and didn't, because I thought we would do that here at the end, and that's what direction does this council want to take or will recommend as we prepare for the remaining quarterly meetings in 2013?
Ray had a question before you.
Ray, did you have a question?
Well, I was just going to echo some of the other comments about all the measuring. With today's technology and ability to gather data, we shouldn't be just measuring for the sake of measuring. And in terms of the rest of the next 3 meetings you're asking about, I would be very interested in seeing at some point this whole thing kind of wrapped up for us, take a look at when it's towards a final position. Because we can have all these discussions and roundtable discussions, but it's until you see it all in one package, then you say, oops, we forgot this or we forgot that. So I think we need to leave some time somewhere along the next 3 meetings to take a look at the final direction or document, whatever it is the board's going to go with.
Well, and to that end, I was going to ask David. I'll pick on you since this will fall in or under your area. But Lee, anybody can join in. Given what you've heard today, how much time do you think we need to let you take this input and feedback, and then go vet the measures, do the research we've asked you to process-wise, and then come back with what Ray's describing?
Moderating aspect is vetting internally, or if you mean vetting with institutions, us coming back to you with stronger measures. Could not allow us time to really perspective as well.
But I tell you what, we could come back with in July as well is the plan and a more detailed timeline for doing that.
Oh, absolutely.
For doing the outreach to the institutions and beginning to get their feedback and ideas.
We'd actually be excited about that piece. We could probably actually, we've got a lot of experience with that. This would really roll out. I'm anticipating that this would really roll out sometime during 2015.
Well, I think maybe in April we could characterize it as part of the agenda. We could get a progress report on how that's going, and then bring back something that is fully baked enough to kind of be a wrap-up of the input from this council, and then ready to go out to that broader audience with the institutions and other policy leaders.
March that's been working. studies that will just focused.
Now, the other mission for this council was to talk about how we can, how Texas can change the culture of higher education towards one of continuous improvement. And to that end, maybe the April and October agendas should have a significant portion sort of dedicated to that. So I'm interested in ideas that you may have for the best way to approach that. I think, Phil, there was, you'd shared some information, I forget what the model was called, but it was something that you were involved with at the University of Houston that you thought would be pertinent to this.
Well, it started at the University of Houston by Dr. Ed Whalen. Now, the University of Houston did not adopt it, but it was started there.
But it was still a good idea? It's still a good idea?
It is. It's responsibility-centered budgeting or management, and it is something that's truly being adopted throughout the nation now by flagship institutions, smaller institutions. Guy had started it at Texas Tech. He's the only one in the state that it was starting it. And the reason he had is that his previous institution, he had experience with it, and he saw the impact of it. And he had started it just when he took the job, I guess, in Alabama. And I think it's worth a peek. It's worth a look. It's being adopted because of the pressure on the institutions in all the other states of trying to become more efficient. There are certain things that create a great deal of angst on college campuses when you adopt this, not the least of which is that presidents lose some of their power. And so presidents fight that a little bit, but then those that have experience are not necessarily as reluctant to adopt it. But it is a true incentive program, and it truly changes the culture of an institution, and it increases value to the students, and that's why it continues to grow throughout the country. And I'm talking coast to coast, and from the Canada to Mexico. It's throughout the institution, throughout the country. It's being adopted. Texas, other than Guy at Texas Tech, really hadn't given it a serious look, and it's worth looking here. And it's interesting that a CFO from the University of Houston is the one that wrote the book on it, and Houston never adopted it. But it is now taking hold, and it's something we need to look at.
Okay. Well, that sounds like something that, are there other ideas that we could bring to the agenda in April, along these lines, or additional, and then now that Guy's in Alabama, I guess we can invite him as an expert from afar.
That's right.
To return and talk about it.
He said, no, Alabama's not going to have anything to do with it, so I don't know.
What other ideas would y'all like to see on the agenda in April? Any other innovations like Phil's described?
I talked to Leah a little bit about this earlier. I want to understand better what our workforce looks like now in the way of education, because I think we've got a major cliff coming. I think when we've already, what we learned is the people that will, I don't know, I'll catch the years wrong, but 35, 40 years old up have a higher degree of post-secondary education than the folks that are younger. I think we need to understand that. I think that you're about the time this thing is supposed to be done, 2030, you're going to have a significant drop-off of college graduates out of the workforce. I think we need to understand that to totally get our mind around that 60% goal, because I think it's going to be a bigger stretch than we realize. But I'm not sure till I see the data. There's also another conversation that some of us have been having, that when you look at the just the population growth of the United States is changing. It's less. There's several studies out there that show that other states were going to be short of folks that are capable of going to college. and that there'll be a raid on Texas. There already is some of a raid, but there'll be a huge raid of people trying to get our high school graduates that are qualified to go to college to go there. You're going to have that. You're going to be swimming up that stream. We need to understand that part. And I don't think we have at least I don't. I'll just speak for myself. I don't have a really good feeling for that base we really have and what our real challenges are. I mean, it's easy to sit in this conversation and talk about these numbers, but I think we need to understand the demographics going on in the rest of the country as far as people trying to recruit our high school graduates, and also this business of the older folks that are getting closer and closer to retirement, and what happens when those folks leave. And it would be interesting as part of that discussion to understand degree Pacific, particularly in some of the STEM fields. It would be interesting to know what the average age of petroleum engineers are, or chemical engineers, or civil engineers. I mean, where are we in those STEM fields? In other words, we may have a challenge that this is a great opportunity to address that we really haven't focused on yet. I'm just sure it's there. Just intuitively, I just know it's there. But we haven't quantified that yet.
All right, good thoughts. Well, I'll just kind of quickly go around. Lee, anything that you would add to the discussion? Or I know at UNT that you had told me in the past y'all are looking at how you embrace continuous improvement in culture in your system.
Looking at that, we now have people scattered around the system. Process review that we are. Of their authority. Former offices. So that's our process improvement. It's actually pre-process improvement because you start off doing the same functions and start finding. 3 years learning how to. People made the initial investment, and his investment. And so then you're faced with, do you spend $3 million to sustain current operations and unsustainable software processes? Embedded at our colleges that are doing manual supported in PeopleSoft. And nobody calculates those costs. They calculate what it costs to install the new software. They don't calculate the 25 business
officers. Well, whether you've got someone that you've hired or are consulting with who is a guru, or maybe it's a matter of sharing some case study examples of where you are and what progress you're making. You might give that some thought, and then maybe share an email with me and the staff that supports this council, and
okay,
we'll try to shape that into a potential for one of these agendas. Ray, any thoughts on this?
I don't have any thoughts on the process, but I do want to point out the article that's in the handout here from the Wall Street Journal about hiring spree fattens college bureaucracy and tuition. It's a very interesting article if you've not read it before, and I would encourage everybody here to read it.
And it's one of a series. I'm not sure how many there will be, but the Wall Street's been doing a series of articles kind of around the concept of value in college education. Pam, you were pretty eloquent before. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Not very eloquent. I know innovation is in our title as well. I think maybe Lee brought it up this morning. We're talking about the institutional cost versus student cost, and where the emphasis maybe should be. And we spent a lot of time, talking about what the institution should or shouldn't do. And I'm interested in how how the institutions are helping us be or could be innovative in the student responsibility in all of this as well. I think we're trying hard to change the culture, which is something we talked about in Closing the Gaps, that we needed to have a college-going culture in this state, and trying to talk to the traditionally underserved populations. But and Generation Texas may be doing it, but I'm interested in also seeing how we can help the students take more of that responsibility in finding the right fit, getting the right degree plans, going to the right institution for them, and also how to pay for it.
Yeah.
That's part of the culture, I think, as well.
That touches on or reminds me of something that we talk a lot about, the shared responsibility, and one of the things that I think a few institutions do this, but I think would be of value if we could find an affordable way to add it to the advisement in high school or college is, aptitudes and strengths testing, so that students gain more self-awareness at an earlier age of just what it is they're good at and enjoy doing. Where do their strengths lie, so that they're more armed to try to then evaluate what degree program lines up with, where their strengths and abilities are. And I don't think we do much of that in advisement, but it seems like it would help students align better when they make a choice.
And that's just a thought off the top of my head. It may be off target and off base, but I think when we talk about culture change, the student, him or herself, needs to be part of that decision. Great point.
Phil, you had your piece, but everybody over here, so I'll start down there at Roberto and then jump to Gerry.
Well, as you know, I always have ideas on something, the Baldridge.
It's not mandatory to talk.
I know, but I can't help myself, right? It's innate. The Baldridge process is one that we're involved in at our colleges, and there are very few colleges involved in that process, and it is a program that requires excellence. It's very rigorous. One of our colleges is real close to getting national attention. Our system is involved in it. There's only been one college in this state that has received the Baldridge Award, and that's one of the schools in Dallas.
Richland, yeah.
Richland, right. And so I think that's a model that we need to look at, especially when you're talking about efficiency and excellence and all those wonderful goals that we have for the state. Because as rigorous as it is, I think it's provided us a lot of benefits. We've been able to weather the budget cuts that we've had simply because we've taken a look at our business processes and really analyzed what we're doing and how we're doing it. The same thing that Lee talked about in terms of using people resources versus technical resources and not combining them well. We've finally worked our way through that, and a lot of it had to do with the way we approach it through this process. So that may be something that would be beneficial for this council to look at. Another thing in terms of students, and there is a cultural issue here that we need to look at, and that is we've been getting a lot of feedback from our business community that our product, our students that come out, are not set up for the workplace. They don't know how to work with teamwork. They're not punctual, this kind of thing. So we're undertaking an initiative using the Covey model to try to develop an experience for our students to teach them leadership skills that will help them as they move into the workforce. So that may be another thing to look at in terms of what kind of curriculum is out there, what kind of initiatives have been taken by other places to do that. And again, we're at the beginning phase of this, and we're hoping to make this a system-wide thing, not just a course offering here or a course offering there. So, because there is such a need. Our population tends now to be very isolated because we're always looking at our cell phones or our smartphones or working in cubicles, and they don't know how to interact with people and bounce ideas off of each other. So we're finding that the more exposure they have to other students, like in the Emporium groups or the learning families, the success rate goes up. So teaching them these people skills that I guess we learned when we were younger and it was just required of us is no longer required of anyone. And so again, our employers, our business community is saying we need, not only do they need to come in with the skill, but they have to have another skill, and that is to interact with each other, work as a team, think collaboratively, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, great points. Gerry, anything to add?
The only thing I can think of we might include, maybe at the April meeting even, is an update on the legislative action that affects higher education up to that point, and might be instructive for us to know what's coming.
Yep, I'll make a note of that. That's a good idea. Jody?
The only thing I would add is, first of all, I agree with Pam from a stakeholder's perspective, but I would expand the stakeholders' perspective in terms of talking about what we're doing to include one of the elements here. It says workforce. Therefore, I would bring in at least bring them in like stakeholders, the business community, and let them know what we're doing. Because we're talking workforce, we're talking employers, we're talking, therefore, and the business community is represented through various organizations in this great state, and we all know what those organizations are. So I would just update the business community. The second group that I would update would be the philanthropic community. If there's any activity to raise money to support what we're doing, I would get them in early as early stakeholders, let them know what we're doing and get some input. Other than that, those are my two comments.
Great input on that, yeah. Sort of kind of a blinding flash of the obvious that I should have thought of. Obviously, those workforce groups are key stakeholders, and it's the philanthropic, the endowments, and Gates Foundation, people like that. Good, really good thought. Brenda?
I could add on to what Lee and Pam and Roberto said, because all those are critical pieces of creating that culture at your institution of continuous improvement, but also creating the culture of that students don't do optional. And I think that has been a critical piece with us. And what are some of those best practices? And I had told the group earlier, it was even as basic for us as explaining to our faculty and staff the value of an associate degree. It became pretty easy to say, well, everybody's transferring. But that value of getting that associate degree before you transfer and going back to some real basics. And that sounds like, well, they should be aware of that, but it's an easily missed step. So I throw that out. But the other piece I'd like to throw out for the group to look at is the voluntary framework of accountability that the American Association of Community Colleges is putting together. And I say that as we're putting together metrics. I think those metrics that are being done at the national level for community colleges, we need to see how that fits with this, because there are additional requirements for collecting data. And how will that fit into what we're doing here? Because we don't want to create these systems that duplicate each other or don't match up, and maybe there's something we can take from those systems to help these metrics also.
And that effort of the voluntary framework for accountability, which organization is leading
It's
that?
the American Association of Community Colleges. And they have the very similar components, the workforce piece, the degree piece, and then they also have the learning outcomes piece that they're looking at.
I'd just like to add, it would be helpful if you guys working with groups like that could encourage, if possible, talking about a metric we have in Texas to use our definition. we're so far ahead, we're finding we're having to ways because everybody else is behind what you guys are.
Okay.
Where you can encourage using a similar measure. Guys, actually.
Okay.
Do as reporting.
Well, and I can get the information, and maybe that would help Lee and Melinda as they're digging into things too.
Yeah, I think it would. And
Okay.
then it might give us an opportunity, like David said, to maybe bring whoever's working on this effort down here to see what kind of
Okay.
data and accountability we've got, and maybe there can be a collaboration there.
Okay.
Harold?
You know, after listening to Lee, if he ever gets tired of being a chancellor, obviously he could be like a takeover corporate mogul, you know. We're here and nothing's going to change. Just send all those people over here. And but I think those are the sorts of things that the universities are going to have to look at. The duplication of services, and somebody has to be leading that charge, and obviously you have with University of North Texas. The other thing is it's coming to light that nothing is quick, fast, and rapid. You know, we're talking about 3 years to get to the point where you can start reorganizing it, and I think it is very important that we do have the buy-in of the institutions. That what we're doing is not something more to put a thumb on them or try to take away their independence, but on a statewide basis to make sure that our tax dollars are being spent efficiently. And I think we're getting there.
Well, thank you. There's no shortage of good ideas and feedback here that I'm no longer worried about having meaningful agendas for the rest of the year. We'll shape this into something that makes sense and then get it out and share it with you. And with that, I think there's another meeting taking over this podium in about 2 minutes. So I'll adjourn this meeting and look forward to seeing you all in April.